It was a snowy winter morning, and the girl was busy preparing food for the upcoming dinner. The smell of a juicy steak filled the kitchen as it sizzled on the griddle. She was just about to flip it when an angry woman suddenly burst in, slapping the skillet in frustration. "Why isn't the food ready yet?" she demanded. Without waiting for an answer, she tasted a piece of the meat, spitting it out immediately. "It's too salty," she shouted. The cook, calm and emotionless, looked at her without flinching. "You expect people to eat this? Especially today of all days," the woman continued, her voice rising with irritation. "Maybe I'll replace you with someone who knows what they're doing. Maybe a man." The girl sighed heavily, turning away. Then, with a strange smile, she replied, "Unfortunately, I can't call on my family's employees to do work outside their duties." The woman frowned, shocked by the girl's insolence, her eyes fixed on her. Meanwhile, another voice echoed through the house. A young girl stormed into the room, shouting loudly, "Where's the item I asked you to find?" she demanded. The cook, slightly surprised but unfazed, wiped her hands and handed over a package. But the young girl snatched it from her angrily, tearing it open only to find it wasn't what she had asked for. "What is this?" she shouted, her anger boiling over. The cook, still calm, sighed and looked at the ceiling. "I saw something like it on Instagram a few days ago," she said nonchalantly. "It's kind of popular." "I know." The young girl, now visibly frustrated, held onto the package tightly, refusing to let go. "Don't you dare touch it," she snapped. "Next time, get me what I asked for." As tension simmered, the woman ordered the cook to throw the package away and get some food delivered instead. The cook, on her way out, shouted back that it wasn't her problem, and the woman could handle it herself. After the shouting match, the girl returned to cooking, humming quietly to herself. But soon the woman reappeared, her tones sharp. "You're free this weekend. We're going to the hospital." The girl blinked in surprise. "Why? What's wrong, Mum?" The woman's face twisted with anger. "Why are you pretending? You know exactly what's wrong. It's been over a year since you got married and still no children." She spoke as if it were obvious. "It's your fault. You need to get smart and figure this out. If you can't, I'll do it for you." The girl stood silent, her breath caught in her chest. After a moment, she smiled slyly. "We've already discussed it with Saya. We'll go to the hospital together." Her mother's eyes widened, grinding her teeth in frustration. Clearly annoyed, she sighed deeply and changed the subject, bringing up the vacant position at the girl's company. Then Brandon knew he was being preyed. The girl smiled again and casually mentioned that her stepfather wanted to work there, but Sok had already taken care of it. Just then a man's voice chimed in, offering to help, but the woman quickly cut him off. If my daughter had been as loving as Ura, she wouldn't need help solving everything. She then turned to her daughter, asking, "What's so great about you anyway?" At that very moment, there was a knock on the door. The guests had arrived. The woman's demeanor instantly changed. She greeted them with a bright smile, welcoming them into her home. The guests marveled at the house, praising its beauty. "Has the house gone up by 200 million?" one asked. The woman laughed and said it wasn't that expensive yet, leading them inside as the girl served plates of food. The guests complimented her, calling her beautiful beyond words, and thanked her for the lovely meal. Soon, laughter and conversation filled the room as they enjoyed the feast. After the meal, the girl stepped out for a moment. Her mother called after her, asking her to bring more meat, but the girl was already heading somewhere. When her mother asked where she was going, the girl didn't respond, lost in her own thoughts. A moment later, the girl was gone. The woman, growing tense, started to follow her daughter, but stopped when she saw the girl glowing with joy as she re-entered the room. The guests fell silent, watching in awe. The girl approached her mother with a smile, taking her hand. "Thank you, Mum, for always being so kind to me," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I'm so lucky to have you." Her mother stood frozen, stunned by her words. Then, with another sweet smile, the girl added, "Sok just called. He wants me to meet him soon." With that, she left, leaving her mother speechless. Outside, in the empty parking lot, the girl sat in her car, the smile fading from her face. She remembered her mother's words, harsh and unfeeling. "Even if today is the day you were born, it's just another ordinary day." The girl hit the steering wheel in frustration, yelling, "This isn't right. It shouldn't be like this." Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Messages from her husband Suk had come in, asking how her day was going. She unlocked her phone to see 4 messages and a missed call from him. Ben began texting her husband. In the first message, he apologized for not being available earlier. The second message explained that he was still delayed in a meeting, but 3 hours later he would finally be free. A small smile crept across U's face at the thought of finally seeing her lover. She exhaled deeply, thinking about everything happening, then glanced back at her phone. 2 hours and 37 minutes had passed. Enduring time with her husband's family, she needed to be at the hotel soon. After responding to Sok, U set her phone down and started the car. As she drove, her thoughts drifted to memories of an evening with her husband. She had been telling Sok that she couldn't sleep in the same bed as another person. He simply replied, "I know." U continued, explaining that maybe she could sleep in the same room, but never in the same bed. Sok smiled, repeating that he understood. He then added, "You won't have a normal family life with me, will you?" Be confused by the question, U hesitated. Sok's smile widened as he said, "I don't care about anything as long as I have you." Her eyes had sparkled at his words, leaving her speechless. Suddenly, Ura snapped back to reality. She stood in a store, staring blankly at the floor. The cashier's voice startled her, asking if she had placed an order under Suk's name. She quickly confirmed, then left the store, realizing she was running late. Rushing down the street, she heard voices around the corner. As she approached, she realized one of them was Suk. What was he doing here? Then she saw Ura standing next to him. Yu immediately turned away, listening intently to their conversation. Sok was telling Ura that she was the only one he loved, that he didn't need Yu. At those words, U's world crumbled. She froze, barely processing what Sok was saying next, that he would file for divorce soon and be with Ura. U couldn't bear to hear any more. The box she had been carrying slipped from her hands, the cake inside tumbling to the ground. Sok and Ura turned sharply at the noise, and there stood Ura, her face blank and emotionless. Ura immediately rushed to her, calling out and begging her not to jump to conclusions. But Yu already knew. There was nothing left to save. She smiled bitterly, turning away from them. Ignoring their pleas, she began to walk quickly, wanting to escape them, their betrayal ringing in her ears. As Ura chased after her, Yu's steps quickened, her anger growing. Ura finally grabbed her arm, forcing her to stop. "Please, just listen," Ura begged, for what felt like the 100th time. Furious, Yu asked one simple question. "Did you know that Sok was in love with you?" Ura couldn't answer, her silence revealing the truth. Ura couldn't answer. Then why did you keep hanging around him? Guilt flooded Ura's face. She confessed that Seok was kind and understanding, and she had assumed her feelings were fleeting. Grabbing Yu's hand, she urged her to talk to Seok, that he could change his mind. Ura gritted her teeth, realizing how selfish Ura truly was. Sok chimed in, attempting to defend himself, but U shot him a venomous look. She ripped her hand free from Ura's grasp and walked away, no longer willing to listen to them. Her pace quickened until she was nearly running, lost in a blur of emotion. She couldn't hear or see anything around her, including the crosswalk timer ticking down. A speeding car bowed through the intersection, and by the time U noticed, it was too late. The car's headlights glared like demon eyes in the dark, and in an instant, Yu's body was airborne. Her heel remained on the ground, leaving a red trail behind. Ura screamed, horrified by the sight. Sok instinctively tried to shield her eyes, but the damage had already been done. Tears welled in Yu's eyes as she hung in the air, thinking of one thing. Why had she ever believed Sok could change? In her final moments, everything became painfully clear, but it was too late. Yu died on the very day she had wished she wouldn't. The story shifts back to the past, to an orphanage on a night when it was snowing heavily. Yu had been abandoned as an infant, left crying in front of the door. She had gone through many adoptions and rejections, but one night, a pair of hands lifted her from the darkness. She was adopted by a wealthy family, and for a time, things seemed to improve. But soon after, her adoptive mother, Jumin, passed away, leaving a deep void in Yu's life. What followed was even worse. Her adoptive father, Shanghai, brought home another girl, the same age as Yu. This girl was Ura, who was overjoyed at the thought of having a sister. U had been diligently practicing piano, playing in large concert halls, pouring all her energy into her performances. But no matter how hard she worked, she could never outshine Ura, who excelled effortlessly in everything she did. Yu watched from the sidelines, always overshadowed by her sister, even in their school years. While her parents praised Ura for her academic success, Ura stood trembling as she looked at her own grade sheet. From the moment Ura was born, she had been surrounded by misfortune, always overlooked. She remembered walking down the school corridor, minding her own business, only to open her locker and have a pile of ruined books and notebooks fall out. The students laughed at her, mocking her for being adopted. She knew exactly who had spread the rumors. Yu looked across the room and spotted Yakan, who was laughing with the others, her voice echoing in the corridor. The pain of betrayal hit hard. Her own sister, enjoying herself while Yu stood isolated. At home, Yu tried to reassure herself that things would eventually be okay. She could get through it. But just as she was finding some peace, a noise outside her door caught her attention. Startled, she stepped out of her room to investigate, but the hallway was empty. On the floor lay several boxes and a letter. Curious, she picked up the letter and opened one of the boxes. Inside was a record player. Confused but intrigued, Yu unfolded the note. It was from someone who had overheard her mentioning her love for old things. Embarrassed by the gesture, he explained that he had recorded some of his favorite old songs for her, hoping she would enjoy them. At the end of the letter, he wished her a happy birthday. The sentiment overwhelmed Yu. She quietly turned on the record player and let the music wash over her. Tears welled up in her eyes. It was the first time anyone had done something so thoughtful for her. Immediately afterwards, she told her friends. Years later, those memories remained vivid. Yu had never planned to marry Suk, but the daughter of the president of WJ Retail marrying the son of his driver felt like a fairy tale. Despite her parents' decision, Yu still felt like an outsider, and Suk's affection seemed to be the only genuine part of her life. She remembered his words, how he had once promised to try as long as they were together. But now, those same words felt hollow, tearing at her heart. Her thoughts snapped back to the present. She was still standing in front of that speeding car. In a blink, Yu was airborne, her heel left behind on the ground. The echoes of Sok's betrayal, the man who swore to her sister Ura that she was the only one he loved, rang in her ears. Her world had been stolen from her, piece by piece. And just like that, Yu's hard life came to a tragic end. But then, something strange happened. A voice called to her, faint at first, but growing louder. Yu's eyes shot open. She was alive. Confused, she found herself back in her bed, with Ura standing over her, asking how she was feeling. "What?" Yu gasped. "Wasn't she dead?" Slowly, she sat up, disoriented. Ura smiled and reminded her that today was the dress fitting for her wedding. She must look her best. Ura's heart raced. Was this a dream? She hurried to the mirror, staring at her reflection, trying to make sense of it. Grabbing her phone, she checked the date. July 19th. But that couldn't be right. Wasn't it supposed to be November 20th? She blinked, staring at the strange marking on her wrist. Panic set in. Could it be that she had somehow travelled back in time? Determined to make the most of this second chance, Yu went to her dress fitting, trying to play along. The seamstress tightened the wedding gown, and as Yu stood in front of the mirror, she sighed, holding back her emotions. The sales clerk asked if everything was all right, and Yu reassured her it was. But when she saw Sok, looking enchanted by how beautiful she looked, her smile faded. In a fit of rage, she grabbed a bouquet and swung it at him, hitting him squarely on the head. Shocked, Sok asked what was going on, but Yu only smiled bitterly. Grabbing a pen from Seok's pocket, Yu tore the wedding dress right down the front. The saleswoman was aghast. Yu declared that this was her marriage dissolution gift to Seok, then casually handed over her credit card to pay for the now ruined dress. As she left the shop, Yu knew that this was her turning point. She would reclaim everything that had been taken from her. She would reclaim everything that had been taken from her. Later, Yu met with a friend in a small, cozy coffee shop. Her friend, puzzled by Yu's decision to meet Dog Ayo, asked why she had called for this impromptu meeting. Yu casually mentioned that she had broken up with Sok, shocking her friend. As they talked, Yu explained that Sok had fallen for Yura, leaving her no choice but to move on. Her friend's astonishment was evident, but Yu only laughed. The conversation turned to Dog Aoyu. The heir to a wealthy family but known for his reckless behavior and obsession with gaming. Yu's friend was skeptical, but Yu seemed unfazed. She had a plan now, a vision for her future that didn't involve Seok or anyone else who had betrayed her. The past was behind her, and this new life was hers to shape. At an upscale event 2 days later, Yu found herself in the company of Dog Ayo, the younger son of the Sogging group, a man with a powerful presence and a well-tailored suit. He seemed like the perfect candidate for marriage, but as Yu scanned him, she recognized the same self-centered traits she had seen in Sog. Yet this time, Yu was different, no longer the naive girl from her past life, but someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Finally, Yu sat across from the guy her sister was interested in. After a brief conversation, Dogok tapped the table with a card, drawing Yu's gaze. He casually told her they should meet at the hotel later. Yu was stunned by his audacity and laughed to herself. Though she'd heard rumours that Dogok was arrogant, she hadn't expected him to be worse than those whispers. Dogok continued, saying he had also heard rumours about her. He understood she wasn't one of the easy ones. He smirked, remarking that Yu was actually quite the entertaining conversationalist. Immediately, Uppal joined in, rosing from the sofa. Front showed up convinced Uppal's math skills and completed their task. Uppel grinned and said it was just a meeting. Uppel raised an eyebrow and questioned whether he always had to be so direct. Uppel grinned and said it wasn't so bad, after all. Yu stared at him. I figured this was a test the moment we met, she said coolly. I'm not a fan of guys who flash a room key as their first move. Dogok, taken aback, tried to recover. He muttered that trusting his future to the woman who made him use that key on their first meeting didn't seem like a terrible idea. He met Yu's judgmental gaze, but couldn't read her expression. Yu stood up. I'm sorry, but I don't think I fit into the future you're imagining, she said. Dogok, unfazed, wished her luck. Yu sighed deeply, deciding it was time to head home. Just as she turned to leave, she heard a familiar voice behind her. She spun around to see Yura standing there, with Seok at her side. The sight of them together made Yu's stomach churn. The reality of her memories hit her all at once. She froze. Yu knew she had to act, to show her sister that she was stronger. Without thinking, she turned back to Dogok, staring him down. Only one round for this test, right? At that moment, Yura noticed her sister in the cafe, her eyes widening as she saw Yu sitting with Dogok. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Meanwhile, Dogok was confused by Yu's cryptic statement. One round? What do you mean? He asked. Before Yura could approach, Yura leaned forward, grabbed Dogok by the collar, and kissed him. His eyes shot wide open in shock. Across the cafe, Yura and Sok stood frozen, utterly bewildered by what they were witnessing. Yura's face twisted from one of joy to one of disbelief and anger. Dogok, still processing the situation, suddenly realized that he was enjoying it. He reached out, cupping Yu's face as he deepened the kiss. Yu's eyes fluttered open, surprised by his reaction, but she didn't pull away. Until she finally remembered why she had started this in the first place. She broke away abruptly, wiping her lips in embarrassment, avoiding his gaze. Dogok blinked, still dazed, trying to comprehend why Yu had stopped. Just then, Yura marched over, her expression stiff. What are you doing here, Mr. Dogok So? She stammered. Sok greeted Dogok, clearly just as surprised. Yura forced a smile and said it was quite the coincidence to run into Yu and Dogok here. Yu, turning to face Yu, simply asked what she was doing there with Sok. Before Yura could answer, Yura turned back to Dogok and smiled. Dinner tonight? She asked, teasingly handing him the room card. Dogok smirked. I think that sounds like a good idea. Yura and Sok exchanged confused glances as they watched Yu and Dogok continue their strange flirtation. Dogok took the card from Yu, and they both smiled at each other, leaving Yura fuming. The scene shifted to the hotel room. Dogok explained that it wasn't a suite, just a business room. He sighed and said, a business room. The number of women that have ever made it this far before. The number of... Yu interrupted, apologizing for the earlier kiss. She told him he was free to report it to Yura if he wanted to. Dogok chuckled, wiping his lips. What are you talking about? He asked. It wouldn't be as fun if we played by the rules. He leaned back, asking why Yu really wanted to meet him. Yu paused, then answered, because of the wedding. Dogok looked puzzled. Is there any other reason for a blind date? Yura turned away. Yura seems to like you, she said quietly. She turned back. Dogok raised an eyebrow. Is that why you wanted to marry me? Jean met her own reflection in the window. At first I thought it was about you, but now I'm thinking about starting a company. She turned back to face him, her eyes hard. I know about your grandfather's condition for investing. The condition is marriage. Once you get married, he'll let you start a venture. Dogok stared at her, processing her words in silence. Yu, sensing his hesitation, asked, What do you think about that? Dogok smiled, surprised by how well she knew his circumstances. Interesting, he muttered, his eyes narrowing. You talk like you know the future. Yu's phone suddenly vibrated, breaking the tension. Dogok glanced at it. Yu checked the caller. Yura. She immediately rejected the call. Dogok frowned. Why didn't you answer? Before she could respond, another call came in. It was Sok this time. Yu rejected it again and shrugged. Doesn't matter. Yu set her phone down and asked Dogok, What are your plans for tonight? She glanced up. If you're free, we could spend the evening together. Then she felt his weight on her shoulder. Dogok's eyes widened, caught off guard. Wait, you saying we should sleep together? How? He burst out laughing, unable to contain himself. Jude stood there, puzzled, realizing too late the double meaning of her words. Flustered, she covered her face with her hand. Dogok, still chuckling, leaned forward, asking, What exactly are you after, are you? A fake marriage, perhaps? I don't think I ask for much. He stared at her curiously. And what do I get out of this deal? The girl didn't know how to respond, and Dogok kept pressing her, asking what if he chose Yi over her. What was the difference? He asked her to prove that she was worth it, or maybe she could charm him enough for him to fall in love with her. U silently stared into his eyes, trying to think of something to say. However, she found herself amused by how similar Dogok was to her. It was entertaining. After a pause, U silently stood up and walked to the wine cabinet, deciding that wine might help them figure things out. She opened a bottle, poured a glass, and handed it to Dogok, remarking that if she were him, she would have bought Nova games instead of investing in hotel keys. Dogok was surprised by her comment, as he hadn't realized her interest in his business. He asked if she heard that from his manager, to which Yu responded by asking if he was the type of person who immediately ran to a supervisor when special issues came up. Dogok smiled, intrigued by her thoughts. Yu shouted. They continued drinking, and after a while the bottle was empty. Yu, tired, fell asleep in bed. Later she stirred, turning over and opening her eyes, only to be startled to find Dogok sleeping beside her. Even in his sleep he looked handsome. But then she noticed something. Her lipstick mark on his neck. Shocked and horrified, she started piecing together the events of the night. She had found Dogok's lip mark. She remembered them drinking together, her removing her coat and then throwing herself at him, saying she wanted to sleep. The memory made her blush. Deciding she needed to leave before Dogok woke up, she tiptoed around the room. But when Dogok shifted in his sleep, she jumped in fright, thinking he was awake. However, he remained asleep, much to her relief. Smiling at how handsome he looked even now, she left some money on the table to cover the cleaning costs and slipped out. As Yu drove away, her expression showed no sign of joy. Eventually, she arrived at her destination, her grandfather's hospital room. Upon entering, she saw him hooked up to an IV. He was surprised to see her and immediately took her hand, apologizing for everything. He told her she was his only granddaughter, repeating the apology over and over, with tears in his eyes. Yu felt a deep guilt. 3 months earlier, her grandfather had passed his entire inheritance to Ura, and Ura knew she needed to verify his words. She glanced around the room and saw his toothbrush, deciding to take it with her. As she reached for it, the door opened, and Ura entered, addressing their grandfather. Ura smiled warmly at him, calling herself his granddaughter, and then started tending to him. Ura turned to Yu, remarking that she lacked respect for her elders and scolded her for not answering the phone yesterday. Yu sighed but pulled herself together, smiling confidently. She told her mother she was on a date last night. Her mother's eyes widened in shock as she asked if the date was with Dogok from the sogging group. Yu laughed and confirmed it, though she wondered how her mother knew. Ura had mentioned it earlier. Yu smiled slyly, saying there would be good news soon. Meanwhile, at Dogok's office, a meeting was underway about the sales of the new game Golden Eye, which had increased by 22% in the first quarter. Despite the discussion, Dogok's mind wasn't on sales. He was still thinking about Yu. Her actions from the night before had puzzled him, especially the money she left behind with a note to cover cleaning and breakfast. As he reflected on her strange behavior, Dogok couldn't help but remember Yu's tipsy state the previous night. She had been talking, and whenever he turned away, she would yell at him, asking if he was paying attention. Rather than being annoyed, Dogok found it funny. Yu had summed up her life in a monologue, laughing at the absurdity of it all. Then, out of nowhere, she asked Dogok if he could see memories. Dogok, staring at the floor, said he could. Yu had averted her gaze, confessing that there wasn't a single moment in her life that had truly hooked her. She asked Dogok how that could be, but he didn't have an answer for her. Frustrated, Yu had sighed and declared that this time it had to be different. Then, to Dogok's surprise, Yu suddenly got up, announcing she was going to bed. Dogo considered. Dogok was caught off guard by the abrupt change in conversation, especially when Yu started undressing. He tensed up, asking what she was doing. Feeling embarrassed, he tried to stop her from undressing, but she protested, screaming at him not to touch her. Dogok was trying to calm her down when he realized she still had a dress on under her coat. Relieved, he tried to compose himself, but Yu, in her drunken state, tripped over a chair and fell toward him. In a split second, Dogok couldn't catch her, and they both ended up on the bed. Yu, already half asleep, pressed herself against him. Dogok was left bewildered, his heart racing. He realized how much he liked her being close, but was also embarrassed by the situation. After a while, Yu rolled over to the other side, giving Dogok a chance to finally stand up. As he looked down at the sleeping girl, Dogok noticed something strange. A license plate on her hands caught his eye. He recognized the inscription. Looking at her, he whispered to himself that he didn't want to remember certain moments from his past either. Stroking her hair, Dogok promised himself that this time, things would be different. The scene shifted back to Dogok's office. It was already 10 a.m., and he hadn't received any calls from Yu, despite her mention of the wedding the day before. Just then, an employee interrupted Dogok's thoughts, asking if he was thinking about work or something else. The employee handed Dogok a tablet, congratulating him. On the screen was a news story titled, "Tycoon So Good," featuring a picture of Dogok and Yu. Immediately he started scanning the article, asking if it was about the second son of Sun Group. The guy responded that this wasn't the most important news at the moment. He warned the director that because of the criticism and scandal, the company could suffer losses. Suddenly, Dogok noticed the author of the article. It was his favorite cousin, Su Jan-non. After turning off the tablet and handing it back, Dogok asked if his assistant had contacted the girl. The assistant confirmed that he had and leaned in to share something even more interesting. He had found out that Dogok and the girl had gone to the same elementary school. Dogok asked if this meant they had a close relationship. The assistant clarified that they didn't, as they hadn't gotten along during that time. Dogok sighed, recognizing this as typical of Su Janan, and immediately asked his assistant to bring the reporter to him. The assistant hesitated and nervously asked if Dogok was planning to sleep with another girl. These words amused Dogok, and a smile spread across his serious face. A moment later, he burst out laughing, leaving the assistant bewildered. Suddenly, Dogok stood up, grabbed his jacket and started walking out. The secretary, confused, asked where he was going. Dogok turned, smiling, and said he was running away. Just as he reached the door, his assistant's eyes widened in fear, realizing it was too late. Someone was already there. The woman stood behind Dogok and asked where he was going. Turning in horror, Dogok greeted her sweetly, asking if she had arrived already. The woman, growing suspicious, asked if Dogok was planning to get married. He nervously confirmed, avoiding eye contact. The woman, frustrated, reminded him that he always avoided looking her in the eye when she asked that. Dogok sighed and admitted that even his father didn't know about it. This revelation shocked the woman, who demanded to know more. Dogok turned to his secretary and asked him to explain his nickname. Surprised, the secretary quietly explained that Dogok was asexual, had no sex drive, and was impotent. The woman was taken aback, utterly shocked by what she was hearing. Dogok smiled, explaining that he had lived with this condition his whole life and had to prove it to people. The woman, still in disbelief, asked if this was why Dogok wanted to get married. Dogok, seemingly unbothered, asked her why she had married his father, even though he already had a wife. In a fit of frustration, the woman slapped him, calling him a rude child. Dogok, stunned, watched as the woman angrily walked towards the elevator. Before she could leave, Dogok grabbed her arm and turned her around. He confidently told her that he would reclaim his father's company and win back both his father's love and his grandfather's legacy. The woman, unsure whether to believe him, asked what he meant. Dogok smiled sweetly, assuring her that he would make it happen. The scene shifted to a beautiful beach. Yu was on the phone, being asked where she had disappeared to. She calmly replied that she was at the beach, which shocked the person on the other end, who exclaimed that she must be crazy. Yu then confirmed that she was going to marry Dogok Aio. The friend on the phone, laughing, asked why she should help her. Yu sighed, hinting that she knew about her friend's secret relationship, which made the friend spit out her coffee in shock. The friend, panicking, asked how Yu knew. Yu reassured her that she wasn't following her, but added that the guy she was seeing had a pregnant girlfriend. The friend, horrified, asked if this was true, but Yu tried to downplay the situation. As the conversation continued, Yu suddenly spotted someone and abruptly ended the call. "If you think I'm lying, try and act out the conversation." Dogok stood in front of her, having finally found the girl who had been on his mind. He asked why she had stayed by the sea, admitting that he hated the beach. Ah avoided the question, asking why he had been looking for her. Dogok explained that she hadn't answered his calls, and that he wanted to return the money she had left. Yu, confused, told him there was no need to return anything. Dogok sighed, explaining that it was unusual for someone to leave a note and run away. Yu, taken aback by his confidence, jokingly asked if he had run out of money. Dogok smiled and admitted that he had suffered a loss, a significant one. He then reminded her that she had mentioned the wedding first, and he intended to take full responsibility. Although Yu was speechless, Dogok smiled and declared that there would indeed be a wedding. He thanked her for the incident and emphasized that her time was running out. If she didn't act soon, her sister would be the one standing next to him. Yu tensed, not wanting that outcome, and told him she understood. Dogok then invited her to have a meal with him, repeating the request when she hesitated. Yu, still uneasy, tried to refuse, claiming that she had her reasons for not eating with others. Dogok laughed, saying not to worry and that he would go first. He reached into his pocket and held out 2 bills, asking her to apologize properly for the kisses, the leaked photos, and the note. Tearing up the bills, he insisted that they should eat together, calling it the first condition of their wedding. The scene then shifted to a cafe where Yu looked around, unimpressed. She asked Dogok why food was the first condition for the wedding. He explained that if he hadn't insisted, they wouldn't be sitting together like this. Yu, frustrated, stared at the table. Dogok teased her, asking if the convenience store food was good enough for someone so squeamish. Yu, still irritated, admitted that at least the convenience store food didn't require her to check the cooking process. Dog noticed that Yu was upset about something and asked her what was wrong. She replied that she would be more downcast when rumors spread that the tycoon's son was now with an adopted girl. Derg tilted his head and found it interesting. Yu looked at him questioningly. Derg asked if he really looked like the biggest villain in the tycoon family, suggesting that maybe the girl was just crazy. Changing the topic, Yu asked if she had done something unnecessary that day. Dirk looked unsure and asked what she was talking about. Yu, flustered, clarified she meant the day at the hotel when they had drinks together. Dirk laughed, surprised that Yu probably didn't remember anything. He teased her, saying they were quite close that day. For example, Yu hugged him, left a kiss mark, and they even slept together. Shocked by his words, Yu hit the table and told him to stop. Duke switched the subject, asking why she was eating so little and whether she had already eaten today. Annoyed, Yu told him not to change the subject and added that it was her food, so she knew better. Duke acknowledged her point, but asked out of curiosity what kind of guys she liked. Yu, puzzled, said she had no preference and asked why he was suddenly asking. Duek asked how he measured up as a boyfriend. Yu's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked him to clarify. Duek said he was starting to like her a little, which is why he was curious about her thoughts. Receiving no answer, he asked again if she didn't have any thoughts about him. Yu stared at him, bewildered. Duek continued, saying they were going to get married, and people usually marry someone they like. Wasn't that right? Yu replied that such things were a waste of time and bad for business, but it wasn't the only response he left to the article either. Dirk smiled sarcastically, expressing regret. He was even feeling a little nervous. He started tapping the table and began to mention that night again, but I cut him off sharply, telling him to stop talking nonsense. Dirk smiled, noting that he hadn't even said anything yet. Ben smiled too, noting that I hadn't even faltered. How was it that she managed to slip up too? Yu noticed that Doek was staring at something on her hands. Looking down, she realized it was the strange inscription that appeared after death. Quickly, she covered it with her sweater sleeve, not wanting him to see it. She asked if he had noticed anything on her wrist. Doek, puzzled, asked if she was hiding something. Yu averted her gaze and said it was nothing. Doek, deciding to change the subject, asked if they could talk about something more important. Yu, serious now, said WJ Retail was about to fail financially, which was why Duik needed a marriage with Yura. Duik confirmed that he had insisted on the marriage as it would help him attract more investors. He explained that marriage was one of the conditions under which his grandfather would invest in the company and, if things went well, he could eventually control the company's shares. Yu smiled and revealed that she had already bought 5% of the shares and that they would sell out quickly as soon as WJ Retail's stock dropped. Dek was impressed by her foresight, but noted that it might take 30 years to achieve that goal. Yu smiled again and said that's why she needed him, so he would invest in her company. Puzenia nochot kasmia vidlacha convenjus kovortsalenda games. Tucha considered whether WJ Retail was worth the investment. Yu promised that he wouldn't regret it. Tucha considered whether she wouldn't regret it. Tushon Talme, Yu uninterested in their games, refused. Yu, uninterested in their games, refused. Tucha continued that what they were doing wasn't much different from playing a game, where there was a 50/50 chance of getting caught. Yu, undeterred, confidently replied that they would succeed no matter what. Suddenly, Yu received a message saying the results of a requested DNA test would be known in 2 weeks. Yu was thrilled, but tried to hide her excitement. Deok noticed her happiness and quietly said he was happy for her. Yu looked at him questioningly. He smiled, saying he liked her plan and encouraged her to keep trying. Deok stood up and Yu realized her plan had failed. He mockingly told her that if she wanted to marry him so badly, she should propose. Yu shouted in disbelief, asking what he was talking about. Deok continued, saying that in that case they'd need wedding rings. No kissing, though. Yu, shocked, started laughing nervously, saying that since it was necessary for the marriage, she would do everything required. Nuuk didn't expect that response. Yu held out her hand and declared that it was a proposal. Later, Yu drove home, deep in thought about the mystery surrounding her grandfather's death and the transfer of the inheritance to Ura. She feared the suicide note was forged and resolved to uncover the truth. As soon as she entered the house, her stepmother slapped her hard, shouting at her for not answering the phone and worrying everyone. Rubbing her cheek, Yu realized she had been wrong to think this woman was her biological mother. Her stepmother, arms crossed, said that legally she was still Yu's mother, unless Yu had found someone else. Yu retorted, asking if it was okay for Yura to have an unlawful relationship with a man. Her stepmother was furious, unable to believe what she had just heard. Yu sharply grabbed her mother's hand, saying she knew exactly who she was. The stepmother who had raised her since she was 9, and Yu added that she would marry Du. Their conversation was interrupted by Yu's father, who came in and demanded that they stop arguing. He scolded Yu for how she was speaking to her mother. Yu, feeling betrayed, argued that she was his daughter too, but her father sternly told her she wasn't like Yura and expressed disappointment in her. Yu was devastated. Then, her stepmother, trying to calm things, apologized to her husband, taking the blame. The father left, telling Yu she'd be staying home for a while. Yu stood there, eyes downcast, feeling utterly defeated. The man, just as he was leaving, turned around and mentioned that she would be home for a while. Yu stood still, her eyes downcast, staring at the floor. The woman sighed softly and called for the 2 maids. As they approached Yu, one of them tried to remove the bag from her shoulder. Yu screamed, insisting she could do it herself. She then pulled her phone out of the bag, holding it out while warning the maid not to touch it. After this, Yu retreated to her room, and her stepmother smiled awkwardly at her outburst. Once inside her room, Yu shut the door behind her. The situation felt surreal. She hadn't thought she'd ever return to this place, yet here she was, driven by a new sense of purpose. She opened her drawer and began rummaging through her clothes, scattering them across the floor. Tying the shirts together, she approached the window, eyeing the height. It wasn't high, but it wasn't low either. Carefully, Yu began to lower her makeshift rope. At first, everything went smoothly, but then her foot slipped, and she plummeted toward the ground before she could grab hold of the rope again. Her eyes filled with fear, and for a brief moment, memories from her past flashed through her mind. The terrifying moment when she was hit by a car. She shut her eyes tightly, wondering if this was death coming for her again. Suddenly, a hand reached out, catching her before she hit the ground. It was the guard, who had luckily been nearby. Gently, he placed her on the ground, then looked at her intently and asked if she had been trying to escape. He added that if she truly sought revenge, she should stay in the house to achieve it. Yu looked at him, confused. Revenge wasn't on her mind. What did he know? The man adjusted his glasses, suggesting her actions weren't befitting of someone like her. Frustrated, Yu told him not to pretend he knew her or her motives. The man smiled and offered his hand. Yu's head was pounding, and she struggled to stand. She asked for her phone, and the man handed it to her, after asking what she planned to do. With a calm but determined tone, Yu replied, "To take revenge." He smiled knowingly and reminded her that he had, after all, advised her to stay. At that moment, the man pressed the intercom button and a voice asked who was there. Dog Ao greeted them, holding a stunning bouquet of roses. When Yu's stepmother opened the door, she was stunned. What he had said was indeed coming true. Dog Ao smiled warmly and asked if he could come inside. The whole family, except Yu, gathered around the table. Dog Ao apologized for arriving unannounced, but the father waved it off, assuring him that the article wasn't worth worrying about. Dog Ao smiled awkwardly, apologizing again, but the father confirmed he'd seen the article and noted that such things were published nowadays without real evidence. Dog Ao nodded, adding that sometimes it's necessary to get rid of something, even if it's the truth. The stepmother couldn't hold back any longer and asked if the article was indeed true. Dog Ao glanced around and asked where Yu was. The stepmother forced a smile and replied that Yu had left early that morning, but Dog Ao, sipping his coffee, wasn't convinced. The father reassured him that he had already spoken to Yu and everything was fine, but Dog Ao said the opposite, that he was the reason Yu had become involved. The room turned tense. The father asked what Dog Ao meant, and after a moment, Dog Ao confessed that the article was true. Meanwhile, the guard quietly stood outside Yu's room, working discreetly to pick the lock. After a successful click, he opened the door and told Yu it was time. She agreed, saying it was time to show her family who she truly was. She walked silently down the hallway, past the guard. The family was still talking with Dog Ao, but the stepmother spotted Yu out of the corner of her eye and became furious. How had she escaped the locked room? Yu looked radiant, her hair gleaming in the sunlight and her simple dress highlighting her figure. The conversation halted abruptly as everyone noticed her, except Dog Ao, who smiled and commented that Yu must have been there all along. The stepmother seethed, while the father only frowned. She left. Yu pulled out a chair and sat beside Dog Ao. They exchanged smiles, glad to be in each other's presence. Dog Ao then boldly announced that he wanted to marry Yu. The room fell silent. The stepmother and daughter were completely stunned by his declaration. When pressed, Dog Ao explained that he had no other choice but to marry for love, not for political gain. He glanced at Yu, reaffirming his intentions, and Yu's heart swelled with a mix of relief and disbelief. The stepmother, visibly shaken, objected, pointing out that Yu had recently been through a breakup and couldn't possibly be ready for a relationship. Yu's father agreed, suggesting it might be best for her to move on from recent events before rushing into anything new. Yu, now tense, lowered her gaze, unsure of what to say. Dog Ao took Yu's hand, promising to help her figure out what she truly wanted. He then stood, ready to leave, telling Yu they had reservations at a restaurant. Moments later, they were in his car, speeding down the road. Yu, still processing everything, asked him directly what his price was. Dog AIO laughed, reminding her that they had already discussed this. At the restaurant, Yu felt uncomfortable, not used to being treated so delicately in such a public setting. She distracted herself by scrolling through her phone, but when she opened a message from Sujan, she realized there had been no response. Her thoughts were interrupted when Dog AIO asked if she was going to eat. Wu assured him she was fine, but was clearly struggling to relax. When dessert arrived, Wu's discomfort only grew, her mind still elsewhere. After seeing the dessert, Yu's expression changed, and Dogok, noticing her reaction, looked a bit perplexed and asked if something was wrong. Yu began trembling uncontrollably, her mind drifting into a memory. In her recollection, a woman offered her the same dessert, smiling sweetly and urging her to open her mouth. Yu, surprised but trusting, told her mother that it tasted. She didn't get to finish her sentence. Her face twisted into horror and pain, and she collapsed to the ground, desperately calling for her mother, her hands clutching her throat as she coughed violently. Something was burning her throat. Frantically, she asked why the dessert tasted so strange. The woman, hovering over her, coldly asked why Yu called her mum, when she should only be addressed as auntie or ma. Snapped back to the present, staring in horror at the dessert in front of her, the memory of it being poisoned flooding her mind. That same woman had disliked her so much that she'd poisoned her. Dogok, still confused, asked again what she was thinking about. A little shaken, replied that everything was fine and turned her head to look out at the evening cityscape. Sensing the tension, Dogok commented that if she didn't want the dessert, he'd gladly eat it. Yu turned back to watch him, her eyes wide with anxiety. As soon as he took a bite, Yu's heart raced, her eyes fixated on him, waiting for something terrible to happen. But nothing did. Dogok smiled, swallowing his bite, and said if she was remembering something painful, she could share it with him. Yu was surprised by his words but touched. Few people ever showed concern for her like this. It was something entirely new for her. After a brief pause, Dogok looked around and smiled, saying this seemed like the perfect place to propose. He then asked if she had prepared the wedding rings and a kiss. Yu, taken aback, thought he was joking, but to her surprise, Dogok got up from his chair and knelt in front of her, wide, dark eyes fixed on Ben's plate. The colour was darkening around his cheeks as he pulled a small box from his pocket. "What are you doing?" she asked nervously. Dogok smiled, opening the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring that sparkled under the dim restaurant lights. "I'm making a real proposal," he said, his voice calm yet serious. Dogok then asked, "Will you marry me?" Before she could fully process what was happening. The ring was already on her finger. Suddenly, Yu asked if Dogok knew she was a zobik, someone who avoided kissing for hygiene reasons and had a strong aversion to uncleanliness. Dogok, taken aback, laughed and asked, "What about the evening we had?" Yu, feeling a little flustered, brushed it off, saying it was just business. Dogok smirked, leaning in and teasingly said, "Well, since it was just business, then..." Before he could finish, Yu grabbed him by the shirt, interrupting him, and declared that since she hadn't proposed, she had prepared a kiss instead. She pulled Dogok close and kissed him gently, standing on her toes to reach him. Dogok's bewildered expression softened as he began to enjoy the moment. Their lips, once inseparable, finally parted. Embarrassed, Wu stepped back, saying, "That's enough for now." But Dogok, not ready to let the moment end, pulled her back by the waist and kissed her again. The scene shifted to Dogok's office on a bright sunny day. Dogok was scrolling through the social news feed when suddenly he saw a photo of himself and Yu kissing. Did he really get caught again? Just then his secretary walked in and teased that the director had become a celebrity. Dogok jumped, startled by the news. The secretary went on, saying it was now official. The director was a public figure. Dogok sighed, understanding the situation. After a moment, the secretary asked if Dogok wanted him to handle the article, maybe even asking Sujan, the reporter, to delete it. Or should he, jokingly, cut off Sujan's middle finger as a warning? Dogok tensed at the second suggestion, saying the first option would do just fine. At that moment, a notification popped up on Dogok's phone. It was a message from Yu asking him to have lunch together. The request left Dogok speechless. Yu? Inviting him to lunch? Without hesitation, Dogok responded that he'd be happy to join her. His heart raced as he turned to his secretary seeking advice. "If a girl invites you to lunch, doesn't that mean she's interested?" he asked. The secretary, pondering, cautiously replied, "Probably." Dogok, unsure, pressed further. The secretary finally relented, adding, "As your brother-in-law, I'd say don't get your hopes up too soon." Dogok, a bit taken aback, laughed nervously. Dogok was leaving his office, heading toward the exit where Yu was supposed to be waiting for him. As he walked, he told himself it would be best to avoid drawing too much attention. Suddenly, he heard someone calling out to him. Thinking it was Yu, he lifted his head with a smile, only to find Yuru standing in front of him, smiling brightly. She began walking towards him, and as she did, memories flooded back. In the past, a younger Yu stood off to the side, scuffing the ground with the toe of her sneaker, watching her sister Yuru from afar. Yuru had wanted to approach her, to reach out, but she had barely taken a single step when their mother pulled her back. The woman gestured toward the vast estate around them, telling Yuru that everything she saw now belonged to her. Then, pointing to the lonely Yu, she coldly remarked that Yu wasn't real, unlike Yuru, who was the real one. It wasn't the first time their mother had said something like this, and each time she would ask Yuru if she understood. As Yuru walked toward Dogok in the present, she thought about all the things her mother had said, how they were, in a way, true. She had everything, the real things. Now, here she was, standing right in front of Dogok, who was clearly surprised by her sudden appearance. She was deep in thought, feeling that Ura didn't deserve him. Breaking the silence, the girl greeted Dogu and reminded him that it was nearly lunchtime. AA suggested that if Dogu had no plans, they could have lunch together. Looking questioningly at Ura, Dogu asked if she meant him. The girl smiled, confirming she had come to meet him and have lunch. Realizing there was a reason behind her visit, Dogu playfully asked if she wanted to eat or get married at the same time. The unexpected question left the girl momentarily stunned. But just a moment later, like her mother, Ura composed herself, smiling, and replied that they could eat first and then get married. As she sank into her memories, the girl recalled how everything in that house had been hers since the day she arrived. Everything in the WJ retail family belonged to her. She was always showered with gifts during the holidays and had never felt inferior to anyone. Her wealthy, tycoon father ensured she received all the love she needed, along with the ideal, socially imposed image of a family. But for Ura, it was all about furthering her legacy, and she wasn't going to let anyone else have it, especially not her obsessive, perpetually disgruntled sister, Dog. Upple remembered the day they first met. She'd been angrily scrolling through social media when she heard a pleasant male voice. She turned to see a tall, handsome brunette who immediately apologized for being late. Unlike anyone she'd met before, he was captivating. Looking into his eyes for the first time, Aura realized he had everything she wanted. They spoke for hours, discussing various topics. Aura mentioned how she believed marriage should be between people of the same status who got along well. Dog accepted her offer of coffee, but when he set his mug down, he told her bluntly that he wasn't thinking about marriage. Shocked, the girl jumped up and questioned him. Standing from the table, Dog said he had no choice but to attend this meeting because his mother had requested it. As she tried to change his mind, Dogok cut her off, saying he didn't want a political marriage. Even though his words hurt, Ura still found him irresistible. She decided then and there that Dogo Ayo would be her husband, no matter what. But as she thought back to that day, Ura struggled to understand why you and Dorguk were together. Why had they kissed that day? Why had he gone to her family's house and asked for permission to marry you on the same day? Seeing them hold hands, Ura couldn't keep her composure. She was filled with confusion and frustration, wondering why he chose you over her. Clenching her trembling fists, Ura knew taking him away wouldn't be easy. Returning to reality, she told Dogok they should eat first and then discuss marriage. But Dogok, clearly irritated, scratched his neck and said he wasn't interested in doing either. Smiling and looking into his eyes, Ura insisted she wanted a wedding. He averted his gaze, confused by her persistence. Turning back to her, he explained awkwardly that he already had a girlfriend. Surprised, Ura asked if he was truly going to marry her sister. Laughing, Dog folded his arms and pointed out that Ura was now trying to stop him. Suddenly, Ura began shouting across the floor that you had someone else, claiming her sister was only using Dogu for revenge. Taken aback, Dogu asked if Ura really believed that, if he didn't marry U, she should be the next option. The girl hadn't expected such a response, and looked at him with horror as the crowd in the building stared. Dogok, with a slight smirk, told Ura that he admired her boldness. He glanced at his watch, apologized, and added that he didn't have time to listen to Ura's tales. Without hesitation, he moved toward the exit, saying he had to leave. Ura quickly turned, trying to stop him, but Sudok interrupted, stating that he already had someone he was meeting for lunch. Curious, she asked who it was. He paused and, with a smile, asked if she truly didn't know. Then, turning back to her, he said he was going to have lunch with someone who often had trouble eating. The scene shifts back a few hours to the WJ retail estate, where Yu had just woken up, startled by an early phone call. Sleepily, she reached for her phone, struggling to identify the caller. Her eyes suddenly widened in shock. A picture of her kissing Dogu had been sent to her, with a message asking if it was a good photo. The sender casually mentioned that her brother was preparing a ring, and they had helped him a little. Yu immediately jumped up, trying to piece together the events of the previous night, recalling how Dogok had proposed and kissed her. Covering her mouth, she realized that he had orchestrated the whole thing in advance. The action then moved to Dogok's building, where Sadu was heading to a meeting, her thoughts consumed by the morning's events. She tried to reassure herself that this was just business and that there must have been a reason for his proposal. It didn't matter who started it. Business was business. As she lost herself in these thoughts, someone called out her name. She looked up to see Seo, her ex-husband, surprised to see her. Yu wasn't thrilled by this encounter and didn't want to engage, so she lowered her head and walked past him. Zor quickly grabbed her arm, asking if she had come to meet Direct Sol and whether they were truly getting married. Annoyed, U pulled her hand away and confirmed it. Sol, frustrated, began shouting, demanding to know what had happened to her. U laughed bitterly, telling him it didn't matter. She already knew Sol had been in love with Ura. Sol was shocked by her words, unable to comprehend how she knew. But Yu expected this reaction and, with little hope in her expression, told him to go talk to Ura. She didn't want him anywhere near her. As she walked away, Seo, still in shock, remarked that Yu had changed. Yu turned and replied that she hadn't changed at all. Seo, however, who had felt nothing from the beginning and was only now trying to fix things, was the one who had changed. Seo was dumbfounded and had no idea how Yu knew all this. He recalled the moment after Yu had left him, telling him that their marriage was over. His grandfather couldn't believe it, questioning Seo repeatedly. A frustrated Seo tried to explain but couldn't finish before his grandfather's hand shot out and struck him across the face, hard. "You're nothing," the old man spat, angry that Seo couldn't hold on to Yu. He asked if dissolving the marriage was all Seo could do. The family was horrified, especially Seo's mother, who tearfully asked what they would do now with the deposit for the store already paid. She pounced on him, demanding answers. Just then, Seo's sister burst in, asking what would happen to her fancy bag and GG dress. The family's overwhelming expectations fell heavily on Seo's shoulders, with everyone urging him to win Yu back at any cost. Seo, staring down at the floor, tried to figure out how everything had gone so wrong and when it had all fallen apart. The scene shifts again, and now Seo is outside, talking with Ura. She casually mentioned that Seo was like family to her, and he smiled, feeling encouraged. Ura held his hand and spoke of how great it would be if they became one family. Confused, Seo agreed, only for Ura to suggest that they could become a family if he married her sister. Seo, bewildered, asked what her sister had to do with it. Ura held his hand tighter and, surprised, asked, "Don't you want to marry Ura?" Seo was taken aback. This girl, who had been sweet-talking him and hanging out with him, was now suggesting he marry her sister. Nevertheless, after a moment of contemplation, Seo turned away and gravely agreed to marry Ura. Overjoyed, began praising him, calling him the best. Seo, meanwhile, realized he had no choice but to move closer to Ura's family. His thoughts drifted back to that night of confession, the night he had spent with Ura. Looking out the window, she talked about how she couldn't sleep in the same bed as another person. She mentioned how sharing a room or a bed with anyone made her uncomfortable. Her boyfriend smiled and reassured her that he was fine with it. He still wanted to be with her. As he stared at the floor, he realized that things had turned out just as Yu had said. Maybe it was for the best, though there was one thing that continued to stress him out. One afternoon, Ura urgently called Seo, asking him to come over as soon as possible. When she got into the car, Seo immediately asked her what had happened and why she needed him so suddenly. Without much thought, Ura started shouting that Yu was going to marry Dog Ao. Grabbing Seo by his jacket, she begged him for help, saying that he was on her side. She tearfully confessed that she knew Yu still cared about her, and even more, she believed Yu liked her too. Ura desperately asked Seo to bring Yu back. Disheartened, Seo looked down and asked if Ura would marry Dogok if Yu didn't return. Ura sighed heavily, tears welling up in her eyes, and said that she would have to, because it was all for the family business. Anne, from what Seo did when she arrived, asked why she was pretending that Dogok didn't like her. He started shouting, telling her that she needed Dogok and he could see it clearly. Sighing heavily again, Seo realized he had no other choice. Reluctantly, he agreed to help and said he would try to convince Yu to come back to her. Ura's expression instantly changed from desperation to joy, and she thanked him profusely. As Seo watched her happiness, he thought to himself that if this was the only way to make her happy, then so be it. The scene shifted to the hospital. It was a sunny, bright day, perfect for Yu to get her test results. She had just left the building, holding an envelope with the results inside. Unable to wait any longer, she stopped and opened it. As her eyes scanned the paper, her expression shifted from curiosity to shock. It revealed that Annan, the man she came to see, was 99.9% confirmed to be her biological father. Yu dropped the envelope, struggling to process the news. How could this have happened? Suddenly, it hit her. The unpleasant woman, Jiang Hai, must have known all along. Even her wool-covered life had been a forgery, a complete fraud. Yu looked up at the sky and laughed bitterly, tears streaming down her face. It hurt to realize that she would only learn about her real father's identity after his death. Later, Yu found herself standing in front of her house. The journey home had been difficult, and she was emotionally drained. As she reached for her keys, someone called out to her from behind. It was her ex-husband Sio's unpleasant relatives. They forced smiles, pretending to care about her well-being. Yu looked at them with disdain and asked what they wanted. Seo's mother began speaking, hesitantly, bringing up the topic of the marriage dissolution. She stumbled over her words, but eventually said they had come because they were worried. Seo stood emotionless as the woman continued pestering her with questions, trying to understand if Yu and Seo had fought. When the woman suggested they should simply ignore the rumors, her daughter Se chimed in, saying, "All couples fight before they get married." Yu, already irritated by their presence, was growing increasingly stressed. Suddenly, Se approached her and took her hand, suggesting they all go out to eat together to lift her mood. Without a second thought, Yu yanked her hand away and made it clear that she had no intention of going anywhere with them. Feeling cornered, Seo's mother then mentioned something about a contract. She hesitated but eventually blurted out that she was considering returning it, and, in fact, had taken out a loan. She sighed and said that everything was falling apart at the worst possible time. Yu, without any emotion, firmly said no and advised the woman to get a job. Turning away, she declared the conversation over and said there was nothing more to discuss. Just as Yu started walking away, the woman suddenly grabbed her arm and pleaded, asking if Yu wanted her to apologize. She begged Yu to reconsider the marriage, insisting that, although she didn't know what had happened between them, not all hope was lost. Looking at her ex-husband's family, Yu calmly stated that they no longer had anything to do with her. With that, she turned towards the door and began unlocking it. As a final statement, she made it clear that she had no intention of marrying Suk. Suk's mother, seemingly resigned, nodded and said she understood, but she hoped their promise still stood. Yu turned around, bewildered, as the woman, now on her knees, continued to plead. She promised she would give everything back, if only Yu would reconsider. Yu, tired of the theatrics, asked directly how the woman planned to return the money. Suk's mother, embarrassed, looked away, unable to answer. Yu sighed, telling them that once again they shouldn't count on her. Turning around, she told them to talk to her son instead. Her disheveled woman lowered her head, and Se, horrified, asked her mother what they should do next. Suddenly, Suk's mum snapped. Grinding her teeth, she lunged at Yu, grabbing her by the hair and dragging her forward. The woman unleashed a tirade, bitterly complaining that Yu didn't even remember her birthday. She ranted that Yu was an ill-mannered girl who didn't know basic etiquette. Yu tried to break free but couldn't. Then she noticed something. A security camera. Realizing they were now out of frame, Yu knew she had to move. Slowly she started backing up, inch by inch, until she was back in view. Se, witnessing the scene, stepped between her mother and Yu, trying to stop the chaos. But Suk's mother was beyond reason. At the last moment, she swung her arm wildly. There was a tense silence as her hand connected with Yu's face. The woman stood there, satisfied, while Yu stared at her, unfazed. Rather than reacting with anger, Yu began to laugh. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Lifting her hair to reveal the forming bruise, Yu asked the woman and Sei if they realized what had just happened. Her expression shifted, becoming sharper and more confident, as she coldly stated that physical assault had just occurred. Sok's mum, still fuming, demanded to know what Yu was talking about. But before she could finish, Sei called out to her mother, pointing upwards. There, hanging above them, was a camera. Sei tried to step away, but then came over quickly. She smirked, while being unsteady. "We are in the frame," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "It means I'll have fun with this now." Sei tried to take them to the police. Panic set in as Sei frantically begged Yu to forget the incident. Sei tried pulling her mother towards the door, urging her to leave. Wu exhaled, relieved. This nightmare was finally over. Just as she reached the doorstep, a man appeared, blocking her way. He asked how she was doing. Wu, slightly taken aback, asked who had sent him. Was it Grandpa? The man silently nodded. Yu then asked how her grandfather was doing, and the bodyguard replied that he was doing much better. Wu hesitated before asking if he would be able to travel to Seoul. The bodyguard said he wasn't sure. As Yu walked past him, the man suddenly turned and asked if it was true that Yu was getting married. Yu, surprised by the question, hesitated, but then confirmed it. The man looked at her, expressionless, and remarked that he hoped the man she was marrying was a worthy replacement for Yusok. Yu was puzzled by his words, recalling the strange things he had said before, like the time he caught her when she was about to fall, or the moment he advised her to stay home if she truly wanted revenge. Then she remembered the day of her father's death. That moment in the car, when she saw a missed call from Juanon, wondering why he had called her in the first place. The scene shifted to a small but charming restaurant. Dogok entered and was greeted warmly by his family, who were already gathered there. His mother beamed, proudly mentioning that she never dreamed her son would finally find a good bride. Dogok smiled, but quickly changed the subject, saying there was something he wanted for himself. As Dogok's sister joined the conversation, the mood shifted. She teased him about going crazy over this girl he liked. Dogok interrupted, starting to tell his story, even though his family already knew quite a bit about the girl. His mother frowned and mentioned that she had heard Yu wasn't exactly a decent girl, asking if she was an orphan. Dogok, irritated, picked up his glass and thought to himself that Yu was far from someone to be talked about like that. Abruptly, his mother slammed her fist on the table, declaring that there would be no marriage with Yu. His father, unfazed, sipped his coffee and said that Dogok could do whatever he wanted. The argument escalated, with his mother yelling, but his father calmly reminded her that Dogok's choices were his own. Dogok watched his parents quarrel, thinking back to how he had always been on his own, making decisions by himself. Finally, Dogok stood up, wishing his family a pleasant meal, and prepared to leave. Just then, Donya, his sister, excitedly announced that their older brother was arriving. The door opened, and a joyful man entered, laughing and greeting everyone. Dogok, however, was less than thrilled at his brother's arrival. The scene shifted back to WJ Retail, where Yu sat on her cozy bed, reading. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening startled her, and she jumped. Yura stood before her, explaining that Seok had arrived and was waiting for her. Yu, frustrated, said she didn't want to see him. She reminded Yu that Seok had betrayed her and demanded to know what he wanted. Ura explained that Seok had come to talk, and Yu, without hesitation, told her to send him away. There was nothing to discuss. But Ura, defiant, said she would let him in anyway. Moments later, Sok peeked in through the door and smiled. Barely containing her anger, Yu asked why he couldn't respect her wishes. She sarcastically wondered if Ura had put him up to this. Sok, surprised, remained silent, confirming her suspicions. Yu sighed, her frustration evident. Sok approached her, pleading for another chance, apologizing for the past, and promising he would never hurt her again. Said frosty lips. But Yu, tired of his words, pulled her hand away and coldly told him to get out. Seok, devastated, fell to his knees, begging her not to marry Dogok, saying it would break his heart. Yu, baffled by his audacity, asked what he was even talking about. Seok, desperate, said he would pretend it never happened, and in that moment, proposed to her. Yu jumped at the turn of events and asked Sok why he was looking at the girl with such intense eyes. He responded that she understood everything and he still liked her. The girl, however, met Sok's gaze with disgust and distress, immediately recalling a day filled with overwhelming emotions. She remembered her sister and ex-husband, a couple once in love, and how he swore his love for her sister. As these memories surfaced, the girl began to smile madly and told Sok it was all a farce. It amused her to watch him pretend to care, but she wasn't willing to pretend anymore. With anger, she accused him of being at fault. Seok tried to reason with her, saying she wasn't like this before. Just then, something small hit him. He picked it up and asked what it was. Yu revealed that her family had visited her recently and handed him a flash drive, warning him that tampering with it would be unwise. It was just a copy. Looking at Seok's disappointment, she told him next time she wouldn't hesitate to go to the police. Defeated, Seok left the room in a fury. As Sok stormed out, Ura was walking down the corridor with a tray of water meant for Sok and Yu. She was puzzled by how quickly he left, but continued on to the room. Once inside, Ura sat across from Yu, confessing that her thoughts had been troubling her for days. She couldn't understand why Yu had supported her meeting with Dogok. Ura asked if her sister had led her down this path. Yu, bewildered, reflected on what Ura had said. It had all happened before her death and awakening. Ura mentioned how she noticed they were treated differently. Yu was constantly ignored, while she was praised. Yu smiled at the comment and said Ura didn't truly understand. Their mother had always said Yu was fake, not real, like Ura. As Ura processed this, Ura reminded her that she could do what she wanted now. Yu seemed to take pleasure in this idea and, without warning, splashed water onto her sister. Shocked, Ura demanded to know what Yu was doing, but Yu only laughed, reminding her that she had given permission to let go. Yu thanked her sister for the encouragement and ominously added that this was just the beginning. Worse things were coming. She even claimed that Dogok would be her husband. Horrified, Ura screamed that Yu couldn't be with him, but Yu coldly told her not to be jealous. Ura, desperate to understand, asked about Sok. They had been planning to marry. Yu calmly replied that she knew Sok loved her sister, which is why she ended things with him. Suddenly, Ura's anger surged, and she grabbed a glass of water, dumping it on Yu. Now both sisters were drenched, but while Ura was distraught, Yu only smiled, victorious. At that moment, a male voice interrupted them. It was Dogok. He looked perplexed, asking if the sisters were fighting. Embarrassed, they blushed as he entered the room, mentioning that he didn't realize he was such a frequent topic of conversation. Dogok handed Yu a napkin, wiping the water from her face, which made Ura seethe with jealousy. To her, Yura didn't deserve such care from Dogok, yet here he was, attending to her. He then asked the girl if she was okay. Yu looked carefully into his eyes, but then turned her head, noticing her stepmother in the doorway, furious. Seeing her stepmother's expression lifted Yu's mood. She told Dogok she wasn't feeling well, taking his hands in hers, and said that things weren't good at all. She pulled him closer, asking for a hug. Dogok, puzzled, hesitated for a moment before they found themselves sitting together in the car. Outside, heavy rain poured down. As they drove, Dogok commented that Yu was quite the actress. She sighed, admitting she had no choice. Silence filled the car as Yu stared out at the passing scenery. Suddenly, Dogok broke the silence by revealing that he had a similar situation with his older brother. Surprised, Yu turned to him, and Dogok explained that they had different mothers. In front of others, his brother pretended to be nice and perfect, but in reality, no one knew his true nature. Yu tried to recall his brother's name. Was it Jang Woko? Dogok confirmed that his brother wasn't perfect at all. With an angry look, he added that his brother was only genuine with him and no one else. Yu didn't know how to respond to Dogok's story, so she remained silent. They continued driving through the heavy rain, and Yu couldn't help but notice how serious and reliable Dogok seemed. She found herself thinking about how handsome he was. After a while, Yu coughed and asked where they were headed. Dogok laughed and told her it was a bit late to ask. Pointing to a building, he said that this was their new home, where they would live together. Yu screamed in bewilderment, asking if he had just picked her up and brought her here without telling her. Dogok calmly replied that if they didn't like it, they could leave. But Yu hesitated, not wanting to follow him. Ignoring her reluctance, Dogok told her to come along and stop freaking out unnecessarily. Soon they were standing in front of the door to their new apartment on the 5th floor. As they approached the door, Dogok asked if she remembered the day at the hotel. Confused, Yu asked him to clarify. Smiling, he said the password was the date they first met at the hotel. Exhausted, Yu asked if that date had any special meaning. Opening the door, Dogok confirmed it did. It was the night they spent together. She stopped at the threshold, her mind flashing back to that night. The night had been relatively normal, but she shuddered at the memory of the morning after and the lipstick mark on her neck. Snapping back to reality, she decided to forget it as soon as possible. As they entered the apartment, Yu couldn't help but notice how beautifully it was decorated. The renovation was perfect. She was puzzled and asked if Dogok really lived there. He confirmed that he did, and asked what she didn't like about it. Yu, still in shock, admitted she liked everything. Then her eyes landed on one particular room. It was entirely pink. She asked, bewildered, why everything in the room was pink. At first, Dogok didn't understand her question. Dogok then said that it was Yu's room. She cried out in disbelief, looking at the cute bear and the rest of the decorations. Dogok was proud of himself, clearly pleased with the renovation, but Yu was shocked, to say the least. She burst out laughing uncontrollably, asking whose idea it was. Confused, Dogok watched her. Yu thanked him for preparing the room for her, but wondered why he chose pink. Such a stereotypical colour. Dogok quickly explained that he hadn't thought much about it, but his sister had strongly recommended the style, which was suggested by his secretary and his wife. Feeling a bit frustrated, he added that if she didn't like it, he could change the room and this time ask for her input. Not lingering in the room for long. Next they went to the kitchen. Yu looked around, pleasantly surprised, and commented that she liked the interior. Dogok smiled and asked her to sit at the table while he cooked something for them. Yu's expression immediately changed, and with horror she asked if he was really going to cook. Dogok replied that he was, since she hadn't eaten anything all day. Yu reminded him that she doesn't eat with others, and was upset that he had forgotten, or maybe never remembered at all. Dogok, tying his apron, reassured her that he remembered and boasted that he could cook better than even the most expensive hotels. But Yu stood her ground, insisting that she doesn't eat food cooked by other people. Curious, Dogok asked why she had such a rule. Yu frowned, then looked down, frustrated. She explained that it was because she couldn't trust anyone. She remembered a childhood incident when her stepmother had poisoned a seemingly ordinary dessert. Every time she recalled the event, she shivered, and from that moment she stopped trusting anyone who gave her food. Dogok, feeling slightly offended, asked if she couldn't trust men too. He looked at her surprised face and asked if she thought he might poison her. He then asked why they were getting married if Yu didn't even trust him. Yu reminded him that their relationship was purely business and that they didn't need to be subservient to one another. Dogok, undeterred, said she would have to marry him regardless. Confused, Yu asked what he meant by that. Dogok repeated that she didn't trust him enough to even eat his cooking. Thinking for a moment, Yu was pensive. Dogok told her not to worry. He would let her watch everything he did in the kitchen. Soon he was chopping vegetables and preparing the meal, while Yu observed, still trying to understand why he was doing all this. Suddenly, Dogok asked if she wanted to beat her sister, Ura. Yu tensed up at the mere mention of her name. Of course she wanted to defeat her. Dogok, while cooking, asked if she remembered what she had to do to accomplish that. Yu, confused, asked what he meant. Smiling, Dogok said that she had to love him. If she loved him, he would love her in return. Kira Tanghai was taken aback, sighing as she dismissed it as nonsense. Dogok laughed, telling her not to deny it, as it came from the heart. Oh, he found it amusing but still didn't see the point. Dogok continued cooking and then asked why she pretended otherwise. Turning to her, he asked who she was really fooling with her poor acting skills. Hira, Janghai, or even the financiers. They weren't so naive. The only way to deceive them credibly was for everything to be real. She had to be real. After hearing Dogok's words, Yu sighed heavily and said she understood. Summarizing, she told him to pretend to love her, but not to make it too fake. Dogok laughed and said she was confident. Too confident, perhaps. Yu, with a proud look, placed her hand on her heart and said that she was confident itself. Dogok smirked and said that in that case he looked forward to seeing her genuine self. By then, Dogok was almost done cooking. The second dish was nearly ready. Yu watched the process, but still couldn't figure out what he had been working so hard on. Finally, Dogok presented his dish, a radish dish with a creamy sauce. It looked truly appetizing. Yu stared at the work of art in bewilderment. Dogok handed her a silver spoon, and Yu looked at him questioningly, asking why she needed it. Dogok explained that if she had any suspicions, she could use the spoon to check the food. He reminded her that she had seen the entire cooking process and knew there was no poison involved. Dogok abruptly approached her, saying that this wasn't right. Yu looked at him in confusion as he scooped up a spoonful of food and ate it himself, to show her there was nothing wrong. Yu, even more puzzled, asked what he was doing. Dogok set the spoon down and, swallowing, told her he was just confirming the food was safe. Dogok smiled and told Yu to look at him, assuring her that as far as she could see, he was fine. Still in shock and confused, Yu continued to stare at him. Dogok held her gaze and told her that she could trust him now, though no, she should trust him. He asked why Yu was silent, but she simply told him to stop talking about it. Perplexed, Do-guk asked again, just to be sure he hadn't misheard. Yu, frustrated, yelled at him, asking if he thought everything was forced. Do-guk looked at her, guilty, and apologized. He hadn't meant to make it seem forced. He simply wanted to have dinner with her. He apologized again, not realizing how it had come across. Yu met his gaze and explained that it did seem forced to her. Then she told him but she had to know that everything changed after meeting Do-guk. Before, she had been cold and distant, like a hedgehog with sharp quills. But after meeting his cousin, she felt so comfortable and, for the first time, truly happy. For Yu, it felt like everything had been a lie. She couldn't understand what was real. She was torn, feeling resentment toward him, but beyond that, she loved him with all her heart. From that moment, she didn't know what to do. She had no one to tell about her return to the past, so she kept it to herself. When she went to work, she focused solely on that and tried to avoid Do-guk. She wasn't ready to face him. Soon, Do-guk left on a business trip, which made things easier for her. But one night at a company dinner, Do-guk showed up, as expected, and sat next to his wife. But next to Yu was also the annoying Dea, who, using the excuse that she was drunk, splashed water on Yu. Do-guk quickly tried to help her, but the foolish Dea grabbed his hand, which infuriated Yu. A little later, Dea was gossiping with her co-workers, mocking Yu, the supposed CEO's wife. They knew the two didn't care for each other based on how they acted. Yu overheard everything and decided to defend herself, saying, "I only came because I'm also an employee of this company. But now I understand why you're uncomfortable. Could it be because Miss Dea is interested in my husband?" Yu didn't hesitate to point out that she had seen Dea holding her husband's hand and had been harassing him for some time. Dea asked if Yu had any proof, and just then Do-guk came to defend his wife. Yu warned Dea to be more careful with her words from now on. With that, Dea and her little friends ran off. Following this, Yu wanted to talk with Do-guk. They went to a park and Yu told him that she had been reflecting on everything. She knew that he had known the truth from the beginning, and yet he had deceived her. She had tried to focus on the good, but to her, not everything felt real, and it hurt. But what hurt her the most was that despite everything, she still loved him. At that moment, Do-guk embraced her and apologized. Yu could no longer silence her heart. She loved him. She had fallen for him and clung to the hope that he felt the same. After talking, they kissed, and Do-guk confessed his love for her as well. Moments later, Yu mentioned that if the dates on their bracelets marked the end of their lives, she didn't want to waste a single minute. Do-guk wanted the same, although he knew this time they wouldn't die. He would make sure of it. And from that day, the two lovebirds reconciled. The next day, Sumi mentioned to Yu that it seemed like the cockroach was going to resign from his job. Soon after, Yu's phone rang. It was Zin, wanting to share something urgent. Meanwhile, Do-guk was in a meeting. It seemed they had captured the person who delivered those photos, but the person had no idea what they were handing over, so they still didn't know who was truly behind it. For H, the most likely suspects were Yu's family. To his father, it was strange. Why would they do this to someone who, even though they aren't related by blood, had lived with them for so many years? But based on past events, they knew Yu's family wasn't loving. Just then, Yuk entered the room. He had overheard the entire conversation and showed them what had been sent to his phone today. He had investigated and discovered it was from someone Yu had been close to since the orphanage. Do-guk mentioned that the person was the secretary of Yu's grandfather. However, Duke added that he had heard Yu's sister-in-law had germophobia and couldn't eat anything other people gave her. He blamed Do-guk for marrying someone so problematic, but his father quickly put him in his place. Even if it hurt, Yu was now part of their family, and they had to protect her. Meanwhile, Yu was waiting for Sujin. As she spoke with Juon, she mentioned the recent photos of the two of them that had been delivered, which meant they wouldn't be able to see each other for a while. However, she asked him to keep an eye on her grandfather and, once and for all, get information about Yura's biological father. At that moment, Sujin arrived, happy to hear that Yu and her cousin had reconciled. Yu then asked Sujin for a favor. to investigate more about Hyunjeli, an employee of her family's gallery who had disappeared years ago. Zin agreed, but she had actually come to share information about Jin. She revealed that Jin had gotten married 15 years ago in the United States, was widowed, and inherited a large fortune. Jin had returned to Korea and used that money to start her cooking classes, but there was no further information about her. Meanwhile, Do-hook visited Jermai's cats, the ones descended from the cat Do-hook had rescued in the past. Thanks to Jermai, the cats were now well cared for, and Do-hook felt at ease. He told Jermai that he wanted to ask a favor. He wanted to learn more about Jong-jeli, the director of the Raon Art Gallery. He knew she was the one with the most power. Do-hook also mentioned that Yu wanted the company, and he planned to make her the owner. He hoped Jaime would help, and Jaime knew there would be no problem. To gain full control, the major shareholder, Yu's grandfather, had to return, and she knew he would support Yu without hesitation. The next day, the cockroach met with Yura. He showed her the photos he had obtained through an agency and told her that he had sent them to President Sei, Gyo-hook, and Do-hook. Sek then asked if Yura had sent Sei to post lies on his profile. Of course, Yura denied any involvement. The cockroach became furious, asking why Yura was so obsessed with the situation. Do-hook knew that doing this would hurt her even more, but Yura was showing just how crazy she was. She told him that all she wanted was to see Do-hook and Yu miserable because it wasn't fair. She had planned to marry Do-hook, but Yu had taken him as revenge. Yura claimed she had never hurt Yu, but Seok knew better. He knew that Yu had spent her entire life enduring abuse and discrimination. Yura then asked Seok that if they found her, he should turn himself in on her behalf. But when Seok refused, Yura added that if he helped her, she would hire a lawyer for his sister. For this one time, she needed his help. In the days that followed, Do-hook went to find his wife at work because they had to go out together. They had a family dinner. When they arrived, everyone was happy to see Yu, especially since the rumors about her had calmed down. However, Do-hook was furious because she knew who had caused this scandal, Yura, a horrible person. But thanks to everyone's support, things were fine. Yu's father mentioned that he had prepared food for her and asked if she could eat it. Now that Yu was recovering, she could, and she happily showed everyone, which made them all excited. But before anything else, Yu had something to share. Just then, Gyo-hook arrived, and he wasn't alone. He had brought Yura with him. Clearly, no one liked this woman, especially Donya, but they couldn't just kick her out, so they quickly sat down at the table. Gyo and Yura weren't asking for permission for a wedding just yet. They were just getting to know the family. Moreover, since Yu was adopted, there was nothing wrong with dating her sister-in-law, Gyo insinuated. This infuriated everyone, but Yu didn't care. She knew the truth, and when everyone found out, Yura would suffer. As Yu was about to eat, Yura expected her to embarrass herself. However, Juk asked about her condition, and Yu took the opportunity to tell everyone that when she was young, she fainted after eating food laced with arsenic. She had nearly died and from that day couldn't eat anything given to her by others. This was a surprise to many, and Yura quickly said, "It wasn't my mother," but Yu added, "Now I'm fine, I've overcome it, thanks to Do-hook." Everyone was thrilled, happy that Yu was now doing better. Seeing how much the family treasured Yu enraged Yura, as she had won the love of the entire family. Later, Yura met with the cockroach and was furious to see that Yu had been accepted by Korea's most prominent family. She blamed Sok, thinking that if he had married her, none of this would have happened. In her frustration, Yura mentioned that the suspicions about a contractual marriage might be true, as Go believed it too. This angered the cockroach. He told her that she would never be able to destroy Yu and was only hurting herself by trusting the wrong people, but Yura didn't want to give up and asked Sok to bring her proof that what he said was true. In the following days, Yu visited her grandfather. She now understood that he hadn't died because of Hon-jae, as he was still in good health. During the visit, her grandfather mentioned that his birthday was coming up and asked what she wanted as a gift. It was amusing because Yu knew her real birthday, but since he was asking, she said she wanted the retail company, and her grandfather agreed. The day before her birthday, she returned home. While talking to Do-hook, Yu shared that her birthday was simply the day she had been abandoned at the orphanage. She didn't even know when she was truly born. For that reason, the day wasn't significant to her. But Do-hook hugged her and told her that, for him, it would be the first birthday they spent together. He promised that from now on, every year they would have more happy moments like this. After some time, they arrived at her in-laws' house, where everyone welcomed Yu with joy. They were all so happy because tomorrow was her birthday, and they had prepared everything just for her. A grand dinner, a beautiful cake, and each of them sang for her, allowing her to blow out her candle. When it was time for presents, she was given 2 extravagant options: a 50-story building or an automobile factory. Yu started to cry, feeling overwhelmed by how much they were giving her. But her mother-in-law reassured her that she deserved this and much more, because she was now part of the family. As they returned home, Yu felt conflicted, like she was taking advantage of their generosity. She couldn't bring herself to refuse her family's gifts, but to Do-hook, money was the least important thing. He told her he could buy her whatever she desired. As they neared their home, Yu noticed the cockroach, Seok, making a phone call, and soon her phone started vibrating. But, of course, she knew that her phone was brating, and she understood that he had come to see her. She asked Do-hook to drop her off nearby, assuring him she would get home soon. Respecting her decision, Do-hook agreed. Yura approached Seok, who, like a fool, had once again been manipulated by Yura. He became aggressive, asking if she still loved him. He insisted that he knew she was only with Do-hook because of a contract. He pressed her repeatedly, but Yu didn't hesitate to tell him that it was a lie. She loved Do-hook. Seok couldn't accept the truth, so Yu slapped him, telling him she didn't want anything more to do with him and that he should leave. Seok, enraged, grabbed her and tried to hit her, blaming her for all of his misfortunes. At that moment, Do-hook arrived and struck Seok, making it clear that he wouldn't allow anyone to harm Yu, least of all him. Do-hook warned Seok not to come near his wife again. After several minutes, they finally made it home, but Do-hook was upset with Yu for trying to handle everything on her own. She had almost been hurt, and Yu apologized, explaining that she hadn't wanted him to have to deal with Seok, and she hadn't expected Seok to react that way. But Do-hook just wanted to protect her, because he couldn't bear the thought of losing her again. Yu reassured him that none of them would die this time. Soon midnight struck, and it was officially Yu's birthday. After sleeping and waking up, Yu knew she had 1 year until the marked date. But when she stepped out of her room, she found, with great excitement, Do-hook had prepared something extraordinary for her. A wonderful feast, just as she had always wished. And that was just the beginning. Later, they boarded a helicopter, and though Yu wanted to know where they were going, Do-hook kept it a surprise. Soon, they arrived at their destination, an amusement park. Do-hook had everything planned out because, from now on, he wanted everything to be real. He pulled out an engagement ring and proposed to her officially. Before she could even answer, the ring was already on her finger, but that didn't take away from how special the moment was for both of them. Afterward, they walked over to a tree filled with photographs of her, and even some costume performers arrived to celebrate. One of them handed her a letter from Do-hook. In the letter, he confessed that from the moment he first saw her, he had fallen in love. But it was the act of going back in time that allowed him to truly be with her. In the beginning, he felt guilty for deceiving her, but simply being by her side made him happy. He asked her to let go of the painful memories and focus on creating joyful moments from now on, as he loved her with all his heart. After this heartfelt surprise, Do-hook took her on various rides. She enjoyed them, while he got scared. By the end, he was exhausted, but there was still more to come. Later, he brought her to a boutique and asked her to choose a beautiful, elegant dress, because they were going to have dinner at a luxurious restaurant she had always dreamed of visiting. Astonishingly, Do-hook had reserved the entire place, so they were alone, dining in the finest setting possible. As he snapped his fingers, fireworks filled the sky outside the window, creating a perfect moment for Yu. But Do-hook had one last surprise. "There's still something left, our first night together." Oh, how forward of him. Yet it was something Yu had also been longing for. When the time came, she was ready to give herself to him, making this birthday unforgettable as it became their first night together. And so it happened. Afterward they talked, and Yu shared that she had never experienced a birthday like this. All her life, Yura had been the one celebrated, while she never received anything from anyone. Today was different, and she thanked Do-hook for making it so special. She loved him deeply, and he loved her just as much. But then Yu revealed something shocking. She was the true daughter of Hunun Han, the president of the retail company. She didn't know if it was fate or how it all came to be, but she had been adopted by another man, while Yura, who wasn't even her father's biological daughter, received all the love and privilege. Do-hook hugged her and asked, "How long have you known?" Yu confessed she had only discovered it recently, after everything that rightfully belonged to her had been taken away. But now, she wasn't going to let that happen again. She was determined to reclaim what was hers, and Do-hook promised to stand by her side in this fight. He would use everything at his disposal to help her achieve what she deserved. After months of hard work, the project for the new video game that Yu was part of finally came to an end, and her contract had finished. Though she would miss it, especially being close to Sumi, she was ready to move on. While Do-hook and Yu were on their way home, Yu asked him to drop her off at her parents' house because it was her father's birthday. She had been preparing his gift for a long time, so Do-hook agreed to wait for her at home. Meanwhile, Yu's family was having lunch, celebrating her father's birthday. But soon, an unwelcome guest arrived. Yura. She had come to wish her father well. As her stepmother knew Yu had struggled with eating food served by others, she was surprised to see her eating with no hesitation, announcing to everyone that she was cured. In addition to that, Yu had brought a gift for her father. Johnny knew what was inside that envelope. It likely contained the blood test results that Yu had shown her before. However, since they were in the middle of eating, Yu's father didn't open it right away. Yura began to irritate Yu by bringing up her marriage, but Yu stayed calm and looked happy, which only infuriated Yura. Unable to handle being around Yu, Yura stormed out. At this moment, Yu's father wanted to check the documents in the envelope, but Johnny tried to stop him. In the struggle, the envelope tore and a piece of paper landed in her father's hands, just the crucial part revealing that both Yu and Yura were his biological daughters. Yu wanted him to realize the truth, that she too was his biological daughter. Johnny, however, thought the document might state that Yura wasn't his daughter, so she tried to dismiss the results, saying that it might not be real. Yu, keeping her composure, asked her father that if he didn't trust the documents, he could have the test done himself. Before leaving, Yu made a request. Since she hadn't yet received a birthday present from him, she asked her father to give her the position of manager as her gift. As she left, she felt drained from the whole ordeal. But as she stepped outside, she saw Do-hook waiting for her, not wanting her to be alone. Yu broke down in tears, telling him how her father had never treated her like a real daughter. And now she didn't know what would happen once the truth came out. In the following days, Yu's plan continued. With the help of Donna and Jin, they began organizing the retail company's papers to uncover the reasons behind the financial deficit. At the upcoming shareholders' meeting, they planned to accuse her father of mismanaging the company, and Johnny would intervene. In the midst of all this, Yu received a video. Footage from the last time she saw the cockroach, Sok, showing Do-hook hitting him. Yu immediately called Yura, realizing she was behind this and was now threatening her. Yura threatened Yu by saying that she would send the video to the press unless Yu divorced Do-hook and returned to her old life. Yura insisted that, as an adopted child, Yu didn't deserve her current position, and if she didn't comply, Yura would ruin her life. But Yu no longer cared, seeing Yura as the real outsider. In fact, since Yura gave her this gift, Yu planned to give her one in return. Meanwhile, Yu's father wasn't sure if it was true that Yu was really his daughter. At that moment, Johnny arrived and planted seeds of doubt, claiming that Yu was only trying to take advantage of him. Johnny suggested that, with the power Yu now had, She could have manipulated the test results just to get the manager's position. Unsure of what to believe, Yu's father hesitated. Then Johnny handed him a cup of tea, and after drinking it, he began to feel unwell and fainted. With this, Johnny's plan began to unfold. Elsewhere, after everything that had happened, Yu decided to meet with Yura. Laughing in her face, Yu told her that even though she was now divorced from Do-hook, Yura would never succeed in being with him. Yu then showed Yura a recording in which she confessed to sending the incriminating photos to Do-hook's father, as well as her obsession with Do-hook and her desire to make Yu miserable. Yu explained that she had withdrawn Seok's sister's lawsuit, and in exchange, Seok had given her this recording, while Yura had only offered Seok a lawyer. Yu clarified that there was no contractual marriage between her and Do-hook. They truly loved each other. And even if Yura did release the video, the Jian group would stop it instantly, and it would only cause trouble for her. Later, Yu met with someone who informed her that they had found Yura's biological father, so her plan could proceed as intended. For Juon, this was an opportunity to be of help. He remembered meeting Yu in the orphanage after the sudden death of his father. After his father passed, several relatives showed up, claiming they wanted to be his guardians to access his inheritance. However, he ultimately ended up in the orphanage, and it was through Yu, who shared his love of painting, that he overcame his loneliness. She became his only friend, and thanks to her, he regained his smile. Later, she was adopted by a wealthy family. Juon also recognized a woman, Joni, the same woman his father had pointed out before he left to meet her, never to return. Years later, Juon met Yu again, but by then she had changed a lot. Her life had become much darker, and he had failed to help her in the past. This time, however, Juon was determined to make things right. On the other side, Johnny continued to push her schemes forward. His husband was taking care of him, but when he woke up and tried to speak, he realized he couldn't. Hongye urged him to rest, assuring him that she would handle the company and convene a board meeting to take care of everything. Poor man. Meanwhile, Yu finally visited the sister of the woman who had adopted her, hoping to learn more about her mother. The woman shared many details with Yu. A month before her death, Yu's mother had confided in her that something felt wrong, but they didn't think much of it at the time. However, a week before her death, she received a phone call saying that her daughter had fainted after eating her food, confirming her suspicions that something was wrong. Yu's mother believed that her husband was having an affair with another woman and suspected that this woman had poisoned her daughter. She even feared that she might be next. Initially, the sister hadn't believed any of this, until her sister died a week later. For Yu, everything began to make sense. After her mother's death, Hongye brought Yura into their home. As Yu was thinking about this, she noticed a bracelet on the woman's wrist, one she recognized. The woman explained that it was identical to the one her sister had. This triggered Yu's memories of the time when she had been poisoned. She had been with her mother, who had prepared snacks for her. Her mother asked her to wait, and Hongye arrived with the same snacks, supposedly sent by her mother. After eating them, Yu had been poisoned. Now she knew the truth. Hongye had poisoned her and killed her mother. Seeing Yu's interest in the bracelet, her aunt gifted it to her, asking her to find out the truth. If someone had indeed murdered her mother, Yu needed to uncover whether her mother's death was a choice or if someone had taken her life. Later, Yu discussed everything with Hyun. She now knew that her stepmother was responsible for all of this, and he was aware of it too. Yoon revealed that his father had also died from arsenic poisoning. Hyun Ye had been his father's lover, and after his death, all of his assets had gone to her. Now, Yu understood that this same woman had likely killed her mother, as she had also died from arsenic poisoning. It was highly probable that Hongye had orchestrated everything. Grandfather Juon reassured Yu that things would be different now, and that such tragedies wouldn't happen again. However, Yu didn't understand why he said again. That's when Hongye revealed the truth to her. He told her that, on the day of the accident, he had planned to tell her everything he had discovered, that Hongye was responsible for killing his grandfather, Yu's mother, and Gon's father. He also wanted to tell her that she was the biological daughter of her adoptive father, but he never got the chance, as he died that day, in the same place as Yu. Now, they had returned to the present, a year before the tragic events occurred. Hyun explained that Honye had sent someone to kill him that day, causing his car accident. During the collision, Yu had already been on the ground, victim to another injustice. Now, Hyun viewed this second chance as an opportunity to make sure Honye paid for what she had done. Meanwhile, Honye had tracked down Yu's grandfather, the last person she needed to control everything. Knowing that Yu wanted to return to the company, Honye planned to strip her of everything. Later, Yu was caring for her grandfather when Honye unexpectedly appeared. She had finally found the old man she had been searching for all these years. She cruelly told Yu that her grandfather had only a few days left to live, which delighted Honye. With no one left to support her, she taunted Yu, saying she would have no reason to return to the company, as there wouldn't be a position for her. Yu, however, said nothing in response. Satisfied, Onya left, not realizing this was all part of Yu's plan. Her grandfather was still in good health, as Yu had deliberately hidden him from her stepmother to protect him. Hyo also knew that Yeon Jae was the current representative of the company, but that didn't matter. She had her own strategy, and her grandfather would help her. The day of the company's board meeting finally arrived. Honye was thrilled, believing the company would soon be hers. However, a man suddenly appeared and greeted her in an overly familiar way. Honye immediately recognized him. It was Suho, Yura's father. She became enraged, demanding he be removed, but at that moment, Jae Hanan, the largest shareholder and Yu's grandfather, entered the room and allowed Suho to speak. It quickly dawned on Honye that Yu had orchestrated the entire situation. Suho wasted no time asking Honye for an explanation. Why had she never told him that they had a daughter together, Yura? Honye was clearly flustered, refusing to discuss such matters in front of the shareholders. Desperate to avoid further embarrassment, she escorted him out of the meeting. As they entered the elevator, Suho expected answers, but Honye wasn't going to give him any. Just then, Yura entered the elevator. The moment Suho saw her, he was overwhelmed with emotion. "You're my daughter," he exclaimed. For Yura, this revelation was like a bombshell. Shocked and confused, she barely had time to react before Honye quickly whisked Suho away. While they were driving, Don Soy expressed to Honye that although Yura now has a good life, he still wanted to be a part of his daughter's life. DNA tests had confirmed that Yura was his biological child, and he felt they looked alike. However, Honye, who knew him well, was fully aware that he was only after money. She intended to offer him a large sum to ensure he disappeared from their lives for good. Meanwhile, President Unan officially started the shareholders' meeting, and Honye had already arrived. The first item on the agenda was the request to dismiss the current president, the son of Mr. Han, supposedly due to his poor management of the company, which was struggling financially. However, with the largest shareholder present, he suggested that the company should remain as it was, and the motion was rejected, leaving Honye temporarily out of the game. At the same time, Yu arrived at the company and ran into Yura. She informed Yura that she had returned to work. After stepping away to talk privately, Yu asked Yura how she felt upon meeting her biological father. Yura, confused and furious, slapped Yu. But Yu, no longer the same person she once was, slapped her back even harder. Yu told Yura that if she refused to believe her words, she would have no choice but to believe the documents. Yura was devastated upon seeing the papers. Yura then added that this was all the work of Honye, her manipulative and ambitious mother. She warned Yura that it wouldn't be long before she and her mother would be thrown out on the street. Yura still had the strength to fight back, but Yura remained unshaken. She reminded Yura that she had already died once because of her, and now it was time for her to return the favor and make her experience the same hell she had lived through. Later, Honye arrived home feeling utterly defeated, but upon entering, she was met with chaos, and standing in the midst of it all was Miss Kim, the woman Honye had accused of theft and thrown out of the house 20 years ago. Shocked, Honye demanded to know why she was there. Then, to her astonishment, the biggest surprise of all entered. The true owner of the house, Yu's grandfather. He was exhausted by everything Onye had done and told her to leave the house just as she had come, empty-handed. Onye left, but on her way out she encountered Yu, who sarcastically asked, "Leaving already? Did you like my gift?" Yu reminded Honye of the time she had said, "There will be no place left for you to return to." Later, Honye came across Yura once again. In a hotel, Yura demanded answers. She needed to know if it was true that she was the daughter of the man who had come to the office that day, and whether Yor was really the daughter of the man she had always believed to be her father. He asked, "Who told you that?" And, upon hearing Yura's response, confirmed the truth. Yura was at a loss for what to do, but her mother insisted that this was not over yet. Yura had to accomplish something in order to defeat Ihu, and of course, Ju understood. Her mother was asking her to get pregnant by Juke. Yura was slapped by her mother for this suggestion, but immediately apologized. "This woman is crazy," she thought. Her mother urged her not to think about anything else, assuring her that all of this would pass. However, Yura was shattered, realizing that she had been living a lie all this time. In despair, she went to a park and called Cucuroccio, wanting to blame him for giving that recording to Ayu. But Cucuroccio told her there was no other option and asked her not to call him again. He had once liked her, but now, everything that had happened just made him feel disgusted by her. Yuri couldn't believe it. He couldn't just leave her like that. She clung to him, but before things could escalate further, Sewi arrived. She grabbed Yura by the hair and chastised her for leaving her behind after all the things she had asked her to do. They started fighting, but it wasn't long before Lo intervened, pushing Yura away and grabbing his sister. They left Yura there, letting her suffer as the worthless rat she was. The next day, Siyu visited Jaime to understand why she owned 5% of the company's shares, which she had apparently held for the past 10 years. Jaime understood that Siyu had come to ask for her support, and she was considering it. However, Ayu wanted to know why Jaime hadn't been open with her, asking, "Are you my biological mother?" Jaime was taken aback and didn't know how to respond. Ihu had already suspected this, as she had learned from her grandfather that Jaime had passed away, but now she knew the truth. Ihu demanded an explanation for why she had abandoned her and why she hadn't told her anything all this time. Jaime apologized, explaining that she had never wanted to abandon her. She thought Ayu had died after her relationship with Ayu's father ended and she was left alone, following the president's orders. The miracle was that she had her baby, but one day a fire broke out in her home. She managed to escape with her baby in her arms, but after 2 days, when she woke up, she learnt that her baby had died and the funeral had already been held. All this time, Jaime had believed her baby was dead until, after her mother's passing, she was told that her baby was alive. Jaime had searched high and low for her and, in the end, discovered that Ihu was her daughter. Ihu wanted to know her true name and her birth date, and Jaime tearfully told her that her name was Li Zhuan and her birthday was May 24th. She apologized once more for everything that had happened. The next day, Siyu visited Jaime. She wanted to know why Jaime owned 5% of the shares in R. According to her investigation, Jaime had held them for the past 10 years. Jaime understood that Siyu had come to ask for her support, and she was considering it, but Jaime wanted to know more. "Are you my biological mother?" she asked. Jaime was stunned. She didn't know what to say. Ihu had already suspected this. She had previously been told that her biological mother had died, but now she saw that wasn't true, and demanded an explanation. Why had Jaime abandoned her, and why hadn't she told her anything all this time? With tears in her eyes, Jaime begged for forgiveness. She never wanted to abandon her. She had thought Ahiu had died after breaking off the relationship with her father under orders from the president. Jaime had been left alone, but miraculously she had given birth to Ahu. However, one day, a fire broke out in their home, and Jaime barely managed to escape, carrying her baby in her arms. But after waking up 2 days later, her parents told her that her baby had died. They even held a funeral. Jaime believed all this time that her child was gone, until on her mother's deathbed, she confessed that her baby was still alive. Jaime searched high and low and finally discovered that Ihul was her daughter. Ihul, shocked, wanted to know her real name and birthday. Jaime revealed that her name was Izihuan, and her birthday was May 24th. Jaime tearfully asked for forgiveness, but Ayu couldn't bring herself to forgive her. Honi had always told Ihu she was worthless, that no one ever wanted her, and that's why she was abandoned. Jaime kept apologizing, but Ihu cut her off, saying, "I don't care about having a mother right now, but I do care about revenge." She asked Jaime for her help. Meanwhile, Ihu's grandfather was looking after his son. He knew it was that woman Honi who had caused all the harm. Fortunately, his son was waking up, and as he did, he began to see the truth. Honi was nothing but a sinister woman who had manipulated him into mistreating his own daughter for so long. He told Ihu that she carried his blood, while Yura did not. He even revealed that Ihu was the daughter of Hoan, or, as she is now known, Jaime. He regretted everything, but it was too late to change the past. A few weeks earlier, Jamie had come to see Unjan, Uhu's grandfather. She had returned as Uhu's biological mother and wanted to support her daughter. She asked him to help Uhu in every way possible, and she would do the same, as she was also a shareholder in the company. On the other side, Honi was contacting every shareholder in the company, scheming against the president, trying to get everyone on her side. Today, she crossed paths with Hyan, whom she knew as Jaime. After exchanging greetings, it was clear that Honi didn't recognize her, but soon, Hyan revealed the truth. She was the same woman Honi had tried to kill many years ago. Hyan remembered that, long ago, when she tried to seduce Ayu's father, he would call out a name in his sleep. Arwon. Intrigued, Honi decided to visit Arwon and discovered that she had a baby. When she realized the child belonged to the man she desired, Honi made up her mind to end their lives. She was the one who orchestrated the fire because she was already pregnant with... Above all, Jamie knew this thanks to Hyunji's secretary, who had revealed everything to her. Jamie warned that if Hyunji ever laid a hand on Yu, Yura wouldn't survive. Meanwhile, Yu was making plans with her grandfather and father. Her father, overwhelmed with shame, couldn't believe that the woman he had lived with for over 20 years had made him treat his own daughter so horribly. Now, Yu asked her father to allow both Hyunji and Yura to return home, as if everything were normal. For now, they would pretend to trust them, but behind the scenes, they would plan their next moves. However, Mr. Mang asked his son what he intended to do about Yura since she wasn't his biological daughter. But to this man, Yura was his daughter, and he felt responsible for his family. This not only upset Ihu, but also her father, who then suffered a heart attack. The next morning, Honi didn't know what to do. She couldn't abandon the plans she had been scheming for over 20 years, but she wanted to escape. Yet Yura refused to run away. She had her father, who, despite not being her biological parent, had cared for her for over 2 decades. So, she decided to return home, which eventually convinced Honi that she couldn't leave them behind. Later that day, they returned to the house. Yura acted as if nothing had happened, while Honi started apologizing, accusing the secretary of poisoning her and deceiving her. Honi's husband wanted to know why she had hidden the fact that Ihu was his real daughter, and she claimed she had only recently found out. He then asked about Yura, and Honi justified herself, saying Yura was indeed her daughter, and that she had DNA tests to prove it. The results showed compatibility, but at that moment Honi stated that due to her husband's current health, she would take charge of the retail company from now on. Meanwhile, Ihu stayed with her grandfather, who, fortunately, was feeling a little better. However, she needed to focus on her health. Although at this point, Ihu was content because her grandfather had already given her a position in his company. Meanwhile, Yura was on another date with Duke, who still didn't know that Yura wasn't the biological daughter of the Lee family. Everything seemed to be going well, and thanks to Yura, Duke now had a new plan to cause trouble for his younger brother. Later, Ayu returned home, and as usual, Duhuk welcomed her warmly, even preparing a feast for her. They ate happily, and during the meal, Hook mentioned that he was ready to return to his father's company and reclaim his position. When he worked there, his grandfather had wanted him to inherit the presidency, but Duke felt slighted, and many problems arose because of it. Duhuk distanced himself from the company, but upon learning that his brother Duke was misappropriating company funds, he decided to return and save his family's legacy. Ihuk promised to support him in every way she could. On the other hand, Aihu had something to share too. She had met her biological mother, Miss Jamie. She had always thought the worst of her mother, but now she finally knew who she was and how she ended up in the orphanage. Although she felt more at peace, she was also conflicted and unsure how to process it all. Dahuk comforted her, hugged her, and reassured her that he would always be there for her, supporting her through everything she needed. Just then, Yu received a message from Hyun informing her that her grandfather's health had worsened. She rushed to the hospital to see him and found out that he had suffered from several heart issues which were now catching up to him. Unfortunately, there was little hope for his recovery, and Yu desperately wished for her grandfather to pull through. In the midst of everything, Yu received a call from Yura, inviting her to lunch with her and Duke. Reluctantly, Yu ended up dining with this nest of vipers. As always, Yuke played the role of the sweet, calm gentleman, only making subtle, hurtful remarks that barely fazed Yu. During a toast, after drinking the wine, Yu suddenly felt unwell. It was clear that Yura had spiked her drink. Meanwhile, Dohuk was at a jewelry store looking to buy something beautiful for his wife. At that moment, Duke called him, informing him that Ihu had collapsed and was now in the hospital. Panicked, Dohuk rushed to the hospital, desperate to know how she was doing. Upon arriving, he saw Yura, who swore she had nothing to do with what happened. But Dohuk didn't believe her, suspecting foul play, until he could investigate further. Yura left, but not without vowing to get revenge for the humiliation she had just endured. She would make them pay for everything. Later, Dohuk confronted his brother Juk outside the hospital. Dohuk knew Juk was nothing but a fraud, responsible for all of this. He punched him several times, but Juk didn't seem to care. He stood up and walked away as if nothing had happened. This fool had been pretending to have a broken leg for a long time to make Dohuk look bad in front of everyone. However, he never had such an injury, and Dohuk had already discovered months ago that Juk had been faking his inability to walk properly. Today, Juk's deceit was exposed. He admitted that he hated Dohuk and their mother for taking everything that was rightfully his, and he would never forgive them. He vowed to fight to the bitter end. After the confrontation, Dohuk rushed back to see Ihu. Thankfully, he had arrived just in time. The doctors had performed a gastric lavage after Ihu had suffered from an overdose of medication, which everyone knew Duke had caused. Dohuk no longer wanted to return to his father's company. He feared for Ihu's safety, knowing that Duke would come after her. But Ihu wasn't concerned. She assured him that she would take better care of herself from now on. But Dohuk knew he had to return and give his brother what he deserved. A little later, he began investigating the restaurant where his wife had fallen ill. It turned out that the waiter who had served them had quit, and it seemed everything had been carefully orchestrated. But Duke wouldn't get away with it. The time had come for Dohuk to use the evidence he had, a recording in which Duke confessed that whether divorced or dead, he would find a way to get revenge on their poor mother. Days later, Yu visited her father to give him the wonderful news that he had fully recovered and could now walk without any impediment. Supposedly, the rehabilitation had worked, and this news thrilled her father. He decided to gather the entire family to share this good news, which played perfectly into Yu Huk's hands, as now Yu had nothing left to use against him. On another front, Yu finally arrived at Betrayal, taking up her position as the head of the planning department. However, given her reputation, everyone spoke poorly of her behind her back. Not everything was bad, though. Yu reunited with Sumi, whom she had befriended at Do-Huk's company, and they made a great team. But of course Yu knew this territory was tightly controlled by Yura and her mother. The worst part was that Yu could no longer even enjoy a simple meal. After the incident with Duke, she had relapsed, longing to go home and eat the rice her husband made for her. Just as she was about to leave, Yura stopped her, asking her to accompany her to a company party. In the middle of this, Yura inquired about her health, which irritated Yu. She made it clear that, as Yura could see, she was fine. Yura swore she had nothing to do with what had happened, but Yu knew better. She believed Yura's thirst for revenge and desire to win over Do-Huk could have driven her to do such things. Or worse. Perhaps Yura was being manipulated by Do. Yura responded, saying she didn't care. One way or another, she would marry Do-Huk and ruin their marriage. In the midst of this, Do-Huk asked Uhu if she had finished speaking. She replied yes, which shocked her, as she hadn't realized he had been listening to everything she said. After that, Uhu and Do-Huk left, and he told her he came to see her because he missed her, and she missed him too. She had been thinking about him all this time. However, the real reason he had come was that Do-Huk wanted to take Uhu to visit his grandfather. And so, the weekend arrived. They visited Do-Huk's adorable grandfather, but when they were alone, Do-Huk played the recording of Yu's confession. His grandfather couldn't understand how his grandson had turned out this way. He felt pity for him, knowing his mother had died young, but he also realized that, given Do-Huk's behavior, he had to make him pay for his sins before they grew any bigger. So, he urged Do-Huk to join the family business, fight for it, and take charge. Days passed and the Seo family held a dinner where Ihu wasn't present. That evening, Kohu announced that his rehabilitation had finally been successful, bringing joy to everyone. But then he revealed something else. He shared that, a few days earlier, he, along with Yura, had invited Ihu for a meal, but the wine she drank was laced with medication, which forced them to take her to the emergency room. Donya believed Yura was probably the one behind it, and Kohu supported her suspicion. After all, it was Yura who had suggested the meal with Uyu to improve their supposed relationship, but no one had expected something like this to happen. Juk swore he would find the culprit, but, of course, Don-Huk added that the one responsible had been hidden. Without hesitation, Don-Huk blamed his brother, suspecting him as the real culprit, not Yura. Naturally, his brother, the saint, vehemently denied it, and the argument only fueled their father's fury. In that moment, Juk received a call. Someone had found the employee, and soon everyone would know who the real culprit was. A few days later, Siyu received a visit from Sujin at work, who was surprised by everything that had happened. Sujin informed her that the whole family knew about her poisoning, which puzzled Suyu. Why hadn't Donya come to visit her? Meanwhile, Yura arrived at the office with sandwiches, trying to buy favor with her co-workers, making them see her as a saint, while Yu only relied on her father's influence. In the midst of this, Donya arrived and immediately blamed Yura, declaring her guilty of poisoning Ihu during their lunch at the restaurant. She insisted that the employee had already confessed that Yura was the one responsible. Yura endured the harsh criticism from everyone, but then Yu walked out of her office with Sujin. Both were shocked to see Donya and rushed to stop her, explaining that her outburst wasn't good for the company. Sujin urged Donna to calm down, and during this moment, Yura seized the opportunity to leave. Before doing so, she told Ihu, "I really didn't do anything. It was Juk who asked me to call you that day, and he arrived at the restaurant first." That night, Yura was fed up with Juk. She went to his house, waiting for him in her car. When he arrived, he clearly knew Yura was desperately seeking to marry him, but he had never intended to do so. However, amidst the humiliation, Yura couldn't take it anymore and revealed to him that she was pregnant with his child. In the following days, Do-Huk visited his father and told him that he still believed his brother was the one who poisoned Hiju, because he always harms what he loves. This time, he handed his father a USB drive containing videos from a while ago, in which his brother walks perfectly. He also gave him an important audio message, asking him to watch and listen to it, and judge for himself. However, he asked his father not to mention any of this to Hohuk. Later, Dohuk and Ihu were walking home, talking about family, when Yu mentioned that it seemed like the marks on his wrists were changing color. Dohuk replied that to him they still looked the same, but he had noticed it too. Yu, however, had a solution. He had been recommended a very good shaman and already made a reservation to go there with Dohuk, which they agreed on. Meanwhile, Yura was terrified. Joe had asked her if the child was his, to which she answered yes, but it seemed like she had doubts about it. When her mother arrived, she saw the pregnancy test on the bed and immediately embraced her daughter, congratulating her. She kept saying that now that Yura was pregnant, she would definitely marry Hohuk. She praised Yura for the good job she did, but this was exactly why Yura never wanted to get pregnant. While her mother was happy, Yura was terrified because she didn't even know for sure who the father of her child was. Yet her mother had already planned her future. Her mother was astonished, asking how she could get pregnant by someone without knowing who the father was. It seemed like Yura was becoming like her, but at that moment, Honi told her that for everyone, the father of the child would be Hohuk. Before anything else, she had to inform the CO family. As the days went by, Yu and Dohuk went to see the shaman, a very wise woman who started telling them that only one person should have died, but in their place, 3 had. The fate was twisted, but at least one person would live. There was a child to protect, just like a cat. She mentioned someone close to Dohuk, but the spirit of the cat would soon depart. The aura and color were weak. Clearly she was referring to the cat that had saved Dohuk. But Ayu wanted to know how to live, and at that moment the shaman wrote a talisman for her. Yu then asked Dohuk to step outside, and once alone she asked the shaman if the others would be saved if that person died. The shaman replied that if the twisted fate returned to its original place, then both would survive. After speaking with the shaman, they headed home, and finally YJ confessed that she knew who the third person was. It was her grandfather's secretary, Huin. He had the same mark on his wrist, and he had died after crashing Dohuk's car that day. From that moment on, the uncertainty of the future began to consume them. The following day, Hiju met with Jun, who apparently already had evidence of the fraud that Hei was committing. He handed over the proof, and Hiju would take care of revealing it in the most eye-caring way possible. Meanwhile, she gave Jun one of the talismans from the shaman so he could have a good life. She told him what the shaman had said, and Heiju agreed to always carry the talisman with him, because he certainly didn't want to die this time. For IU, this was crucial. They needed to find a way for all 3 to be saved. In the following days, Yu met with her mother, Haimei. Haimei told her that she would soon retire, but before doing so, she wanted to provide evidence of what Yu had done. She hadn't spoken up until then because she had been preparing for a special moment. But then Haimei never thought of telling her that Yu was her daughter. Haimei hadn't had the courage to say it. Every time she wanted to, she saw Yu happy and just couldn't. For Hiju, this was selfish. She had spent her whole life believing that she didn't mean anything to anyone, but all of that changed when she met Dohuk. So, at least for giving her life and letting her meet Dohuk, she was thankful to her mother. Meanwhile, Dohuk went to talk to his beloved brother and brought 2 cups of coffee with him. Once alone, Dohuk came with the apparent intention of reconciling. But of course, Hohuk knew it wasn't like that. When Dohuk noticed he hadn't taken a sip, he asked, "Do you think I put something in it?" Hohuk hesitated, took a drink, and Dohuk said, "You're right, what would I gain by doing that?" As Dohuk checked the time and saw nothing happening, he was surprised. "It seems I didn't put enough in." Dohuk then said, "Soon you'll start feeling dizzy and pass out." What a shame. Hohuk began to feel unwell, and Dohuk added, "I was just joking, but if you ever touch my wife again, what you just experienced will happen for real." Before, Dohuk had backed off in the face of his brother, but from this moment on, he would never retreat again. In the afternoon, Yura went to meet the supposed father of her child, who had just finished work. He met her, and although she was excited, he wasn't pleased to see her. He took her to a cafe and wanted to get straight to the point. What did she want? As expected, Yura wanted to marry him, unless he wanted the news to hit the press. She wasn't threatening him, she just didn't want to raise a child alone. However, for Jahu, marriage without love didn't interest him. He wanted to know how much money she wanted to disappear from his life. But Yura wasn't after money, she only wanted power. Hoku, a man without scruples, cared little about this woman's desires, although she was more influential than him. Still, he wasn't going to let Hoku get away with it. The next day, a new shareholders' meeting was being held at Redtail. After some playful exchanges between Ihu and Dohuk, they headed to the session, where Ihu's father and the venomous Honjit arrived, both powerful figures. But soon, everything would go wrong for this woman. At that moment, everything began. Yu sent the message, and the president's secretary entered. Clearly, Yu's father knew everything and was playing his role very well. But the best part was that every shareholder received the same message from Yu, the news that the president of the Rowan Art Museum, he was the prime suspect in a tax evasion case. Yu knew this was her doing, and she ran after her. But by then the police had arrived and were taking he into custody as a suspect in a tax investigation. Hugh had arrived at her appointment for the rhyme moved by Hugh, but had never received a penny. She had sold several paintings to the collection managed by Hugh, but had never received a penny. So, goodbye, little bird. The best part was that all the insults and her confession to Yu were well recorded on Yu's phone. This was just the beginning. Yu returned to the session, and her father was already accepting her new position as head of the office. Meanwhile, Hyun informed Yu that Han Je would be released within 48 hours or less unless an order was issued, but Hyun knew this was just a test for what would come next, so for now he wouldn't do anything further. On the other hand, Dohuk was talking to his sister Donya, who mentioned that a few days ago Yu had visited the family alone and opened up to them, revealing all the suffering she had endured at the hands of her family, especially her stepmother. But the most shocking part was that she turned out to be the biological daughter of her adoptive father. Hearing all this made Dohuk nervous, so he headed to see his beloved Yu. Meanwhile, in Song Gang's office, Dohuk's father was talking to Juk. He invited him to the family dinner that evening, which Juk had no intention of attending. In the middle of the conversation, his father said, "I know everything, and there's a line even my son can't cross." Juk pretended not to know what he was talking about. But Dohuk understood. He finally told his father everything, not knowing what this old man would do with him. Meanwhile, Dohuk was walking with Yu, enjoying the spring, and it was their first time seeing this beautiful place. They saw a family so happy, and Yu began to dream of a future, hoping to survive the deadlines of their lives. She wished to find true happiness with him. Dohuk promised that nothing would happen to them, and that together they could be happy. Meanwhile, Dohuk's mother was preparing the entire dinner for the night, but at that moment someone arrived uninvited, the annoying Yura. Donna and Jonna were about to kick her out, but in the midst of this, Yura started her drama. She pretended to be disgusted and informed them that it was because she was pregnant, leaving everyone stunned. Of course, Yura was pregnant with Hohuk. Because of this, Dohuk's parents asked Gyor to come home immediately. Both of them knew about the pregnancy and wanted to know how he was going to take responsibility. Dohuk's father knew that he apparently had no intention of marrying her, and indeed Juk didn't plan to marry Yura, which disappointed his father. So he decided not to see his son again, neither at home nor at work, and those two annoying lovebirds were left with nothing. That's what happens when you're sneaky. As they left, they started shouting at each other, mostly him, blaming her for them having nothing. He thought about getting rid of her, but it seemed like she wanted to marry him no matter what. Given the situation, Juk took Yura to an office tel, a type of studio apartment in South Korea, where she would stay until the baby was born. She wasn't allowed to do anything foolish. Just wait. Assuming the baby was his, they would figure out what to do. But for now, because of her foolishness, she had ruined everything, and from now on, he forbade her from doing anything like this without consulting him first, or he would not take responsibility for her actions. Days passed, and Xianye met with Gin, her secretary, who accused her of being involved in the fraud with IU. Shunye offered her money in exchange for the evidence and to let things go. The woman was furious because Shunye had threatened her family. So, if she wanted the evidence she had collected, she asked for 10 billion won. Onjae was not going to give it to her, and then the woman said, "Then 1 billion." But she didn't accept it either, so the amount was raised to 20 million, which infuriated her, as Hyun didn't intend to submit to people like her. Ultimately, she knew nothing this person could do would hurt her. She left, and this woman, Hyun, had only followed Jeon's orders. She assured the woman of her family's safety and an agreed-upon sum of money. But now, with this recording, she added more evidence to imprison Hyun. Meanwhile, Hye was furious with Hye-jin and was already planning to silence her forever. But then she remembered Do-hook. She called him and asked for his help with something, killing someone, and of course she'd pay him for the favor. Do-hook was thrilled to help her and asked for 5 million for the favor. Honye accepted, as now no one would get in her way. The next night, Do-hook met with Jeon. He gave her the recording of the call with Jae, and also provided his bank statement showing the 5 million she had transferred to him. Thanks to this, Honye would definitely go to prison for many years. Although Do-hook was receiving money in exchange for this, he also got photos of his beautiful daughter. Photos that were the best reward. Meanwhile, at Yu's father's house, he had gathered the whole family. Hye arrived, looking like a goddess, and they started to eat. At that moment, Yura felt nauseous, and Jeon told Yu about the pregnancy, but Ye laughed at her, already knowing that the baby's father didn't want to marry Yura. Jie didn't know this. After eating, Ye's father asked Ms. Kim to bring a document from his office, and handed it to his wife. It was the divorce papers. She didn't understand what was going on, but her husband clarified everything. He had been seeing through her all this time. Yu enjoyed every moment of it. At that point, the doorbell rang. Miss Kim opened it, and it was the police, accusing Hye of fraud and informing her that Do-hook had confessed and presented all the evidence for her case. Honye couldn't believe this was happening. She defended herself, and Yor suffered because she couldn't believe her mother was this kind of person. In desperation, Honye warned that Yu wouldn't get away with it. But now Yu was not alone. Finally, her father opened his eyes and told Hye that his daughter would receive everything from him, the house and the company. It couldn't have been clearer. She would have nowhere to return to, and worse, she would rot in prison. The only way out for Hye was for her daughter to marry Yuk. This devastated Yura because now the only thing that could save her and her mother was if the child she was expecting was Yuk. In desperation, she asked to see Hyehu the next day, and they met. Yura wanted to seek help from her sister because she didn't know how to raise a child alone. She begged Hyehu to help her. But Hyehu shared something else. Onja had tried to kill her and her biological mother, so why should she care about the child Yura was expecting? Hyehu told her the truth, that her biological father was Do-hook, and that her mother had tried to buy him to kill Hye. Moreover, Hye had killed Hwan's father, and also Hye's adoptive mother. Because of all of this, Hye wouldn't show any mercy, and hoped Yura would suffer as much as she did because of both of them. After that, she walked away. The next few days, Sejio continued to worry about the deadline marked on her wrist. Given everything that had happened, she was finally free from her past. But then Do-hook arrived, wanting to spend much more time with her. He kissed her and informed her that since their marriage had only been contractual before and hadn't been officially registered, they could do so now because they were now a real couple. Yu wasn't sure about it. The shaman had told her that only one of them would die, and it could be her. If she died, Do-hook would be left alone, and she didn't want that, so she asked to postpone it for a little longer. Do-hook understood what she was concerned about. Later, they started planning their life together. She didn't want a new wedding, but rather just photos of the two of them. She wanted to travel, and he wanted to return to the sea to face his fears, just as he did as a child. Every wish for their beautiful future filled them with hope. Maybe they could truly have a happy ending. In the following days, Yu met with Juon. Thanks to her help, he was finally in prison. She asked Juon to focus on what he loved most and gifted him the Rayon Art Museum, where he could display her father's artwork. This was her father's greatest dream. From now on, Hyun was free and could devote himself to what he loved most: art. Days passed, and Juon visited Hye in prison. He confronted her, telling her about all the plans he made to get her incarcerated. But now, what he wanted to know was why she killed his father. For her, it was simple. Hyun's father chose to die, and she had nothing to do with it. Hyun was furious and expected a confession from her, but he didn't threaten her. She remained as calm as ever, though saying that thanks to her daughter, she would be out of prison soon. However, Hyun assured her that it wouldn't happen that way. Hyun, her secretary, had already submitted all the evidence, including recordings from her victims. So, Hyun would never leave prison, and he warned her not to do anything else, otherwise her precious daughter would suffer the consequences. This left Hye in despair, thinking that she truly needed her daughter to marry Hook if she ever wanted to get out of prison. On the other hand, the precious daughter had asked Juk to bring her fried chicken, but this heartless man didn't bring it. They started to argue, but he didn't have time, and besides, he could have asked for it. Yura knew that Hook was hardly interested in her baby, and she desperately tried to get his attention, though nothing was working. Yura screamed at him because she was the mother of his child, but for Yuk this was just a desperate attempt to keep him, and it wasn't working. However, Yura wanted his help to get revenge on Dohuk and Ayu, and this caught his interest. Yura promised she wouldn't cause him any more trouble from now on, but in return she wanted him to kill Ayu. Hook spent days thinking about it. Killing Ayu wasn't a bad idea, especially because an opportunity was coming. Just then, his new secretary, Miss Kim, entered, an ally of H. However, the fool that JH was didn't know anything, and as she pretended to follow his lead, he became interested in her. He thought about taking her to a fancy dinner that night, but his plan was ruined when Yura showed up to see him. She immediately began marking her territory, and Miss Kim had no choice but to leave. This infuriated him, and he asked Yura, "Which will be easier, dealing with IU or dealing with you?" He then warned her not to bother him and to be patient, waiting for the news she was so eager to hear. Days passed, and an important executive meeting took place aboard a cruise ship. Yu attended alone, but the most important thing was that she came to secure investments for her company. She had her sights set on director Lee Zanger, the head of a vegan cosmetics company, which would one day become one of the largest companies in Korea. Yu didn't hesitate to take advantage of the moment and made a deal with this company. Later, she went with Yumi to watch the fireworks, but Yumi went to the bathroom. Left alone, a man approached her. He supposedly came on behalf of one of the most important figures in the cosmetics world. Yu didn't hesitate to follow him, a grave mistake. As soon as they were alone, he began to strangle her. After making her dizzy, he pushed her into the sea. Weak and drowning in the deep blue sea, all the good moments from her life flashed through her mind. But, above all, she remembered the love she had received in this life. She never thought that, due to a momentary lapse, her life would end this way. But unexpectedly, Dohuk entered the water, rescued her, gave her air, and she revived. However, due to his trauma, he couldn't bear it any longer and started to drown, sinking deeper and deeper. The next day, both Dohuk and Yu were in the hospital, but due to the events, Dohuk didn't wake up. He was in a deep sleep, reminding her of a little kitten, the same kitten he had once saved. Nube. The kitten greeted him, and just then it saw a bright light. It immediately ran toward it, and when it touched the light, a flash appeared, and Dohuk came back to life. He woke up and saw Yu, who was very frightened, and she wanted to know how he had dared to go into that place. Dohuk explained that he wanted to see the fireworks with her. When he saw her in the water, his fear vanished. He simply thought of saving her, so he jumped into the water to rescue her. Fortunately, they received help in time, and both were fine. After thinking about what could have happened, Yu wanted to leave her fear behind, just like Dohuk had done. When Dohuk mentioned wanting to register their marriage, she was happy, but she was still afraid of leaving him alone. However, after experiencing this, she understood that now was not the time to doubt. So she asked him that once they were out of the hospital, they would go together to register their marriage, and they agreed to it. On the other hand, Do-hook's father summoned his son Hook and clearly asked him, "Did you have anything to do with what happened to Do-hook?" He denied it. But his father added, "If it was really you who did this, I will never forgive you." Later, Do-hook received help from his brother-in-law, who informed him that the suspect who pushed Je had been arrested before he could flee. They investigated his phone and bank accounts, and as Do-hook had suspected, the real culprit was Je-hook. They discovered that it was him who had been depositing money into the criminal's account. At this, Do-hook remembered the warning he had given to his brother. This time, he wasn't planning on staying idle. The following days, Do-hook and Hyu finally returned home, where they could embrace each other without anyone watching them. In the hospital, all they could do was kiss, and now that Hyu was also expecting this, the two lovebirds began to express all the love they shared. The next day, Do-hook met with Se-wong, his psychiatrist, who was happy to know that he was doing well. During their conversation, Do-hook asked how Se-wong's relationship with Se-son, his best friend, was going. Supposedly the two had a secret relationship, although Do-hook was happy for them, believing they deserved to find true love. Soon after, Ms. Kim, the current secretary of Gil-hook, arrived with the evidence of Gil's crimes. Finally, Do-hook had the opportunity to make his brother pay for everything. Shortly after, Do-hook arrived at his brother's office, facing him. Gil-hook asked if the suspect had been caught, and Do-hook confirmed, saying he hoped the accomplice would be apprehended soon. Gio replied, "That sounds good." But Do-hook took the opportunity to ask him why he had done that to him in the past, why he had tried to kill him. Jo-hook replied that it was a long time ago, an accident in which he was the one who ended up hurt, breaking his leg. Do-hook added that he had always considered him his brother, even though they had different mothers. Despite the fact that he had pushed him into the sea, he still trusted his brother, believing it was just an accident. However, because of him, Do-hook had to live as the son who caused his brother to become a disabled man. He finally understood that Gil-hook had never really loved him. He only wanted to take away everything that made him happy. He had even tried to kill Noobs, his cat. "Do you have proof?" Do-hook confronted him. "You can't imagine what's coming." He had touched something he should never have. Now that he had said everything he felt, he could tell him that he no longer considered him a brother. "I'll repay every blow," he said. Gio was terrified, but Do-hook added, "Wait, just wait." The next morning, Do-hook visited his father, who asked about his son, who had survived thanks to Do-hook arriving just in time. The person responsible had been caught. However, Do-hook had so much more to tell his father. He confessed that back in the accident at sea when he was a child, it was Joe who had provoked him. He had thought it was just an accident, but it was easy to realize that Go had wanted to hurt him. Since that day, Do-hook had lived with nightmares, feeling like he was drowning, unable to see the sea or enjoy a walk on the beach. Today, he was handing his father the proof of the crimes his brother Gio had committed. He had already given all of this to the police and didn't need his father's support. He just wanted to inform him about what was going to happen in their family. His father clearly suffered upon hearing this. Later, he called Gio and shared everything he knew about him, showing him the evidence Gio had provided. Unfortunately, this would harm the company, but he couldn't do anything about it. Gio, however, insisted that none of it was true. But his father had known all along what his son was capable of. He had only been lying to himself, trying to justify it, but now he could no longer do that. He had endured everything because he was his sick little son, but that was over now. Gio-hook begged for forgiveness, but his father couldn't do anything. No one would support him from now on. Gio finally exposed his thoughts, removing his mask. He blamed his father for everything that had happened to him. He claimed his father had abandoned his mother, causing her death at a young age. His father had let her leave the house and allowed that dirty woman to take the place that rightfully belonged to his mother. His father slapped him, saying he shouldn't speak that way about someone who had not cared for him. Now he understood his son's resentment and why he hated Do-hook so much. But he clarified that he had not abandoned his mother. She had abandoned him to live with another man and had even left her son behind. He wasn't lying. He had a letter from his mother written to him where she explained that their marriage had been arranged by her family, that she didn't love him, and that she hoped he would take care of their son. His father explained that he had thought his mother would return, but instead she left with the man she loved, abandoning her newborn baby. Years later, his mother died, and her parents lied to Gyo. They hated Do-hook's father's new wife and extorted him for money, threatening to reveal the truth about what had happened. His father never told him the truth to protect him, to spare him the pain of knowing his mother had abandoned him. But now, he was asking his father to apologize for everything he had done. In the following days, the news caused a huge stir. The suspect in the attempted murder of Aehu was sent to prison, but the mastermind behind it all was Gyo-hook So from the Seong gang family. After that, he was taken to jail, and Gyo lost absolutely everything. H, who learned of this, felt sorry for Do-hook. But he was the one who had done all of this because his brother had tried to hurt her. Now, he felt free, as when he died in that alternate future, he regretted not fighting against his brother, but now he had finally done it. From now on, he just wanted to be happy, and thanks to this new beginning, he had Aehu by his side. Days passed, and Aehu went to visit her friends. They arrived at a place to eat what she had always wanted, instant noodles. However, as she tried to eat, she felt nauseous. These weren't the usual nausea symptoms, they felt strange. Donna quickly understood, and even Sujin shouted, "You're pregnant!" Aehu couldn't believe it, the words kept echoing in her mind. That night, she took a pregnancy test, and it came out positive. After learning the result, she ran to see Do-hook. When she told him about the pregnancy, he jumped out of bed, excited. They were going to be parents. He hoped it would be a girl, but of course, the gender was still a mystery. They were both so excited, but Aehu still felt uneasy. 5 months remained until her due date, but now her baby was growing inside her. Do-hook reassured her, telling her not to worry because everything would be fine. They just needed to enjoy the present moment. The next day, they both went to the hospital, where they discovered that their baby was growing well, healthy, and large. Do-hook promised Aehu that he would protect her and care for her no matter what. However, at that moment, Yura entered the hospital. Upon seeing Aehu with an ultrasound, Yura asked if she was pregnant, and Aehu confirmed, saying she was 5 weeks along. Yura seethed with rage inside. But Yura only congratulated them and then walked away. Aehu, after running into her sister, knew she had to visit someone today. Her biological mother, Jaime. She shared everything about her pregnancy with her, how it happened, how she was coping, and most of all, why she had to face it alone. After hearing this, Aehu understood a lot more. Upon finding out she was going to be a mother, she thought of Jaime and wanted to tell her first. She had so many questions about whether she would be a good mother, if she could care for her baby well. Jaime told her that she had the same doubts when she became a mother, but what she cherished the most was the idea of someday getting to know her, and Aehu felt the same. Jaime asked her for the chance to be a good grandmother, and Aehu accepted, feeling grateful to have her mother by her side. A little later, Aehu and Do-hook called an emergency meeting for his entire family. After seeing the anxiety in everyone, Do-hook showed them the ultrasound photo of their baby. Yes, they were going to be parents, and it was an exciting moment for everyone. However, his father still thought about Ju. No one supported him, and they left him to suffer in that place, like a rat. Do-hook clarified that this wasn't anyone else's fault but his own. His decisions led him to this point. Afterward, Do-hook went to the office, but had a conversation with his brother-in-law. It seemed that Gyo-hook was doing well in prison. He didn't look bad at all. Because of this, Do-hook asked his brother-in-law to keep an eye on every move his brother made. It was a real concern. Since Gyo-hook was part of such a wealthy family, she had her own money, so she approached the man who could get anything done in prison. She offered him an unimaginable amount of money to exact revenge on Do-hook. That night, Do-hook and Ihu celebrated their wedding anniversary. For them, this moment was almost unthinkable at the beginning of their relationship. It hadn't started with love, but now everything was different. However, her life was ticking down. Only 2 months were left until the due date, and they were worried about the baby. Even though Do-hook assured her that she and everyone would be fine, especially since the baby was already 15 weeks along, Ihu cried. Do-hook promised that no matter what, they would be together as a family, and they would survive. Days passed, and Ihu and Do-hook's family spent quality time together. Ihu's baby bump was starting to show, and her nausea had been controlled. Everyone was concerned about her, and in a way they were grateful for her existence. By this point, everyone was eagerly anticipating the baby's arrival. They'd bought countless baby items, and even Do-hook was already thinking about having a baby herself. As time passed, November arrived, and it had been over a year since her accident. Her birthday and the due date were fast approaching, and it made her anxious. She didn't fully understand what it meant that the mark on her body was darkening more and more, but she had faith that, for the sake of her baby, she would survive. Days went by, and Do-hook continued to cook delicious meals for the pregnant Ihu. Looking at the calendar, he too felt the anticipation for the birthday. He promised Ihu that they would spend that day together and that nothing bad would happen. 2 days later, Ihu visited Ihwan to congratulate him on the artwork he had recently exhibited. He was happy, but he hoped to one day return the museum to Ihu, as he planned to travel to France to promote his art. As a birthday gift for Ihu, he gave her the last work from her father, something he had wanted to give her for a long time. Time passed quickly. There wasn't a day that Ihu or Do-hook didn't enjoy their love. They were already preparing for the big moment, installing cameras and hiring security. But November 20, 2021 arrived, the day of Ihu's birthday. Do-hook tried to do everything for her to make the day special, but the uncertainty of the day weighed heavily on them. They spent time playing and distracting themselves, trying to stop thinking about it. They began to focus on the future and what they would do after today. But in the midst of this, Do-hook received a call from his brother-in-law, who told him he was outside their house and urgently needed to talk. Ihu told him to let him in. Do-hook went outside to meet his brother-in-law, but he had come to deliver terrible news. Do-hook had escaped from prison during the trial that day. He managed to flee, and that's why he came here. Because he was scared that Do might try to harm them. His brother-in-law warned that letting him escape had been the worst mistake they could have made. Soon after, a man arrived at Do-hook's apartment. Ihu thought it was one of the security personnel they had hired, so she let him in and offered him the bathroom. Unknowingly, she made a mistake. The man was Do-hook. He quickly subdued her, making her unconscious, and took her away. By the time Do-hook returned, he noticed that Ihu was gone. He searched frantically and then checked the security cameras, uncovering the truth. Do-hook immediately contacted Ihun to inform him of what had happened, and Ihun joined him to find Ihu. Using his knowledge, Ihun managed to find the license plate of Gehu's car. He also informed Do-hook that it seemed Gehu had bought a bomb and had it installed in that car. Meanwhile, Ihu woke up, scared but trying to calm herself for the sake of her baby. Gio told her that after everything Do-hook had done to him, he no longer had any reason to live. So, what better way to go out than by taking the most precious thing from his little brother? He revealed his plan to her. He was going to make that car explode. But Gio didn't want it to be just the two of them. He wanted to make sure many more people suffered. At that moment, Ihu remembered that Do-hook had given her a watch with an emergency call feature. She used it, which allowed her to send her location to him. Gio revelled in what was about to happen. He would have loved to see his brother's face after what would happen to his wife. Meanwhile, Do-hook was already checking the location Ihu sent him. Shortly after, he spotted his brother's car. Just then, he received a call. It was Gio, sounding so pleased. He wanted his brother to hear his wife's voice one last time. She was begging him not to get any closer, warning him that there was a bomb in the car. Geo explained his plan, saying that he wasn't going to leave this world alone and he would have excellent company. At that moment, Do-hook collided with Geo's car to show him that he was right behind him. Geo and Ihu were both stunned. Just then, Ji-yeon also arrived at the scene. In a coordinated effort, he and Do-hook crashed into Geo's car to stop it, causing it to crash into a tree. Geo tried to stay calm, hoping for a miracle. Do-hook wasted no time in rushing to Ihu. He opened the car and reassured her that everything would be fine. But then Geo grabbed Ihu. He wanted them both to die together, but there was nothing he could do. Ihu managed to free herself, and the two of them ran away. They realized that this was the same place where they had died before. But they could hear Geo losing his mind as he tried to escape. But Geo couldn't stop laughing. He began to say that they were no different from him, but at least he admitted his selfishness. After hearing this, Do-hook left Ihu with Ju-won. He wasn't going to let his brother die this way. Despite how difficult this was for both of them, Do-hook ran to Jeo's car. The bomb was about to explode, and Jeo didn't want anyone to save him. Time was running out. Only 15 seconds left. Ihu managed to free herself from Ju-won and ran to Do-hook. Meanwhile, Gu grabbed his brother, wanting to die with him. Do-hook managed to pull him out, but just at that moment, the bomb exploded. The blast reached both Gu and Do-hook, and even Ihu, who was too close. She was terrified and couldn't imagine her husband being dead. No, that couldn't happen. Do-hook found himself between life and death. He reunited with Noob, his beloved cat, and not just him, but also with his grandmother, who was happy to see her grown and handsome grandson. She knew how much he had suffered, but she wanted him to know that everything would be okay from now on. She had to leave, but he had to return. It wasn't his time yet, and if he returned, she and Noob could finally rest in peace. After that, Do-hook's body returned. Meanwhile, Ihu was frantic. She wanted Do-hook to come back. After the explosion, he had been in a coma and hadn't woken up. Do-hook urged her to rest for the sake of her baby, but Ihu wanted to be there when he woke up. She knew he would. She cried, but also felt strong. Then Do-hook woke up. They were both overjoyed. From that moment, the fear was gone. Although it had been difficult, they had finally changed their fates. However, Do-hook still wanted to know what had happened to his brother. H took him to where Gyo was. The explosion and the crash had left him like this. His legs no longer worked. What he had pretended to suffer for years was now his reality. Gyo was furious. But after hearing from Do-hook that he would never walk again, Gyo hated him for not letting him die. He wanted to kill Do-hook. Do-hook told him that if he wanted that so badly, he first had to pay for his sins, and when he was out, he could visit him. After saying this, they left, but of course, Gyo's situation had only worsened. Meanwhile, Ju-won was also in the hospital due to the crash. He had a broken arm, but he was doing better now. The most remarkable thing was that the terrifying future they had feared had passed, and from this moment on, all that was left was to live in happiness. However, Ihu wanted to know how Ju-won had found her at that place. Ju-won simply felt that it could have been fate's game, so he went to the same place where he had died that day. He had sacrificed himself for her because they were friends, and he would do it again and again. It was only because of her that his life had found meaning. He told her how much she had meant to him when he was in the orphanage. Now, he asked her to just think about being happy and to smile more from now on. On the other hand, Donya informed her parents that Do-hook had woken up. Her father felt guilty, knowing that he had raised him badly. But for Yoonga, she also acknowledged that she hadn't raised her son well either. After everything that had happened, everyone knew that Do-hook spent many more years in prison. Just then, the doorbell rang. Donya opened the door and saw Yura. The baby had already been born and Yura was fed up with her life. She asked them to take care of the baby, who was also Ho-Ho's, because she couldn't do it alone. She was considering abandoning him. But Yoonga asked for a DNA test first. If the child turned out to be her grandchild, she would not hesitate to take responsibility for him. However, if not, she would not bear that responsibility. She asked Yura to wait and promised they would contact her. They asked for the baby's blanket to conduct the test, and afterward, Yura left. Meanwhile, Aihu was still in the hospital. Due to what had happened, she was constantly monitored to ensure the baby's health. Yes, there were twins. Heimi was happy to know that her daughter was doing well, so once she was fully recovered, they would make the most of the time they had lost and live as mother and daughter. 5 days later, Yura received the DNA test results and could finally confirm whether or not the baby was Juk's. She discovered that the little boy with brown hair was not Juk's son, and soon they would find out whose child he was. After learning this, Yura visited her mother. Given what had happened with Yur, marrying him was no longer an option. She also told her mother that the baby wasn't Juk's, and she didn't know what to do with him. She felt alone and asked her mother for money. The baby was crying, and she was growing more and more desperate. Seeing this, Honji shouted at her daughter, telling her she should have been better than her mother. In her desperation, Yura visited her father, hoping he would let her stay with him. She explained how hard it was to be a mother and just wanted a good place to raise the child, but her father refused. He gave her money, hoping she wouldn't come back to him, Yura pleaded, saying she had lived as his daughter for over 20 years, but her father didn't trust her after everything her mother had done. He told her that the best thing for the baby was for her to take full responsibility and learn to be a mother on her own. Yura was filled with rage and hated Ihu. With the money she received, she planned to find out where Ihu had moved, using the alias El Cucaracho. Days passed, and finally, Ihu and Dohuk returned to their love nest. Now there was no mark that could limit their lives. Nothing remained but to wait for their happily ever after and to raise their babies together, who were soon about to be born. The babies started kicking, as if internally shouting that everything would be okay, that from now on only love and happiness should fill their lives. Meanwhile, Yura was terrified. She couldn't handle the baby anymore. He was crying and she was losing her patience. But that day, she finally received what she needed, the address. She held her baby and said, "We're leaving this place with Mummy," thinking to herself, "I can't do this on my own." At the same time, El Cucaracho was introducing Yuri, his girlfriend, to his family. They welcomed her with excitement because she was a woman with money who, with luck, would become part of their family. They had prepared everything to make Yuri feel accepted, hoping it would charm her into accepting his proposal to marry him. But in the midst of this joy, Yura showed up uninvited. Siwi opened the door and saw a baby. She couldn't stop Yura, so she entered at the worst possible time. Siwi asked about the baby's father or if she was already married, and then Yura dropped the bomb. "She hasn't married because this baby is Sio's, isn't it beautiful? In one way or another, she would be with her." What better punishment than for everyone to find out that Yura's child was Sio's, also known as El Cucaracho? It was a shock, especially because this meant goodbye to Yuri and goodbye to money. Seo couldn't deny his involvement with Yura. He apologized to Yuri and she quickly ran out, not looking back. Yura didn't have much time to be happy like a lombitch, perhaps referring to her fleeting joy. For now, El Cucaracho was getting what he had always desired, Yura. But soon he found himself alone with Yura, asking if it was true that the child was his. And just in case she didn't remember, this was the result of a night that was ultimately his fault, the night she was completely drunk and called him. Despite their argument, he stayed to keep her company and, during that time, Yura lost her senses, calling him Dohuk. He seemed to want to take advantage of the situation, and so they spent the night together. When she woke up and her mind was clear, she realized she had spent the night with her Cucaracho, and that he had supposedly been seduced by her. He shamelessly washed his hands of the situation and told her he regretted what had happened. They agreed to forget about it, but for him it was something he took to heart. They had thought they'd move on, but now the result of that night had borne fruit, and they had a child together. So, even if he wanted to get rid of Yura, he couldn't. Christmas arrived, a beautiful time to gather with family. Fortunately, both Aihu and her babies were doing well, and today Doho's father wanted to give Aihu a special gift. When she opened it, she found a model of their new house. truly beautiful. But the most beautiful part was their new beginning and the arrival of their babies. In the blink of an eye, the year came to an end, leaving behind the uncertainty of her old future. That was now in the past, and from this moment on, a new story was being written. As the days went by, the long-awaited moment arrived. The birth of their 2 babies. This brought joy to everyone, especially to Jamie, who now spent time with her daughter. And I know you all want to see the babies, so here they are. These 2 beautiful children, the fruit of Ihu and Dohuk's love, named Yuk and Eon. On the other hand, Yura was now free of all worries. She forced her mother-in-law to care for her grandson and even cook for her. Finally, Yura gave her a taste of what the old woman used to do to Ihu. However, knowing Yura, her suffering wouldn't last forever. The days passed, and the 2 babies of Ihu rested peacefully, with Dohuk taking care of them at home. One day, Ihu arrived to find everyone asleep, until Dohuk woke up. Ihu was about to leave the house when, in the middle of it, they had some visitors. Donya, Jimmy, and Yona, who wanted to see the babies. They were asleep at first, but the noise soon woke them up. It was perfect because now Donya could hold her nephews, and they were so fascinated by them that they quickly embraced their new roles as grandmothers and aunts. Given the visitors, Dohuk asked them to watch over the babies while he and his wife went out for a date. Months passed, and Dohuk asked his father for another year off before returning to work, despite having already requested a year. But Dohuk wanted to spend as much time as possible with his babies. He thought 1 year would be enough, but it wasn't. He needed 1 more year to help Ihu with the children. He agreed, but in return he expected 10 photos of his grandchildren, Yuk and John, every day. After some negotiation, they settled on 6 photos daily. However, if he wanted to visit his grandchildren today, he would need to go home soon, because Jamie and John would be taking care of them, as it was their wedding anniversary. Dohuk left to meet Ihu, who had written to him to go to the first place where they had met. Of course, he knew exactly where that was. Upon arriving at the spot, as soon as he saw her, she handed him a card from the same room they had shared before. And so, their night began well, as they expressed their love for each other and enjoyed celebrating 1 year of marriage. Months passed, and on November 20th, 2022, it was Uhu's birthday. A year had passed since that mark disappeared from their lives. At first they were still afraid, but now they were more certain than ever. The future was full of opportunities and, most importantly, happiness. They now had 2 little people in their lives, 2 children who were their reason for being. On the other hand, as expected, Yura couldn't stay untouchable in that house. She soon took charge of her little one and was treated like a maid. "Yura, wash the dishes. Yura, cook. Yura, your mother is a murderer, you know. Yura, I hate you. Because of you, I had to marry you and you ruined my life," etc., etc., etc. The truth is, it's a bit sad. Yura didn't start out this way. Her mother turned her into this. But not realizing in time how wrong her actions were led her to this point, ending up with a terrible man, not to mention the family. But the worst part was that now she could only be in this place. On the other hand, Ihu dedicated herself to running the Rowan Art Museum, which belonged to her family. However, while she worked, taking care of the children was incredibly tough for Dohuk. He looked exhausted, and when Yu suggested hiring a nanny, he refused. He felt capable of caring for their children, even though it wasn't easy, especially with 2 of the same age who fought, threw food, and were impossible to control. Dohuk was drained, but these were the sacrifices of the job. One afternoon, when the 2 little angels started fighting, they caused a toy train to fly across the room, hitting Dohuk square in the face. E rushed over and told him to stay calm, but "I'm fine" wasn't true. His nose was bleeding, and the children were scared. Ehuk couldn't stand it anymore and decided they absolutely had to hire a nanny. Dohuk agreed. However, Ihu had a plan. What if they both went on a trip? It would be a chance to relax and serve as a second honeymoon. Meanwhile, Yura visited her mother in prison. When Chonye saw her daughter, she looked at her disdainfully. "What are you doing with your life?" Yura felt terrible. All of this was her fault. If she hadn't played with her from the start, if she hadn't made her believe things that weren't true, neither she nor her grandson would be in this situation. But for Honyi, that child wasn't hers, and that was what hurt Yura the most. In this, Honyi asked if she had heard anything about Yu, and Yura told her that Yu was fine, living a dream life and happy. This made Honyi furious. She truly wished that Yu would get what she deserved. But now Yura no longer wanted revenge in her life. Didn't she remember why she was there? After saying this, and realizing that, to her mother, she was just a pawn in her game, Yura decided to cut ties once and for all. She told her that she would never see her again, and if her mother ever got out of prison, she shouldn't try to find her. In the end, Yura had lost everything, including her daughter. On the other hand, Yu left the twins with Haimi, their grandmother, who took care of them with so much love. She was thrilled to be able to do for her grandchildren what she hadn't been able to enjoy with her own daughter. She cherished the time she had with them, having them all to herself. Meanwhile, Ihuk and Dohuk were going on a trip to the same place where Ihuk gone alone for her honeymoon. But something beautiful happened along the way. Dolphins started jumping over the water, almost as if welcoming them to this beautiful place. They finally arrived at the same spot where they had stayed once before. As they reminisced about how Dohuk had surprised her by crossing the boundaries for the first time and kissing her to celebrate their first kiss, today Dohuk kissed her again. Later they went on a hike to climb Mount Harsan, an incredible place so remote that after hours of walking without rest, they finally reached the summit. Now they could enjoy a peaceful afternoon together. Even so, they missed their babies. While there, enjoying such a beautiful view, they decided to video call their kids. Both of them were well taken care of and excited to see their parents in such a wonderful place. They promised that they would return soon and that they would all be together again. For their second anniversary the following year, they went to one of the most luxurious restaurants in all of Korea, where Ihu got to taste a variety of dishes she had never had before. Thanks to Dohuk, she was now able to eat without worry or fear and savor these delicious foods. Later they went to the beach, and just as Uhu had overcome her traumas, Dohuk had done the same. Today, he showed her that he could enjoy simple pleasures like dipping his feet into the sea. For both of them, getting to know each other had been a healing experience, and today they were happier than ever. For their third anniversary, they spent an amazing evening alone, enjoying photos of their growing children. Ihu still felt a little sad. She wished she could hold them as babies again. However, there was a solution. It was the perfect time for Dohuk to start working on giving their little ones a sibling. For their fourth anniversary, Dohuk planned something big, a celebration with a new wedding. Ihu hadn't been able to fully enjoy their original wedding, so Dohuk had prepared a beautiful white dress for her. It was an emotional moment, especially since Dohuk had also prepared a ring for the most important woman in his life. A month after their fourth wedding anniversary, they shared the good news with the whole family. Ihu was expecting their third baby, and everyone congratulated them. It was clear that they weren't wasting any time. The arrival of this baby was especially exciting, as their other children were now older and thrilled to welcome a new sibling. Months passed, and it wasn't long before the baby would arrive, and Dohuk reveled in the joy of it all. Finally, after several months, little Jun was born. She was so beautiful, truly a princess and Daddy's little girl. But time passed, and Yura continued living the same life as before. She had to endure her horrible mother-in-law, putting up with her insults and humiliations simply because she had nowhere else to go, and a child bound them together. She had to swallow everything for herself, but one day she decided to go out for a while without a particular destination, aimlessly wandering, trying to clear her mind. Then she saw an advertisement for Ihu's new art collection at her museum. Upon seeing it, she was filled with rage, not because of Ihu but because of herself. Ihu was right. She was now living in hell, and there seemed to be no way out. Days later, Ihu presented her collection at the museum. Everyone praised her, especially her two beautiful princes who adored their mother. Yet, something was still missing. The presence of her princess and the love of her life. Not only them, but the entire Do-hook family, including Ihu's mother, also arrived. They filled her with flowers and compliments for her incredible work. For Ihu, the day couldn't have been better, but it was, because even Gon came to see her, happy to find her so joyful and smiling. This family was truly full of joy. There wasn't a day when Do-hook didn't enjoy spending time with his children. For Ihu, this life was perfect. She had love everywhere she looked, and they were all complete. 5 members of this beautiful family, though soon another member would join them. That afternoon, the little ones found a small kitten, one that looked very much like Nube. As soon as the kitten saw Do-hook, it approached him affectionately, as if it knew him. This surprised him, and he remembered his little kitten. The children also wanted to keep it, and just then a man passed by. He knew about this kitten and saw how someone had abandoned it there. But, thanks to this opportunity, Do-hook decided to adopt the kitten. Of course, he needed Ihu's approval first. Seeing how excited Do-hook was and how their children wanted to raise the little kitten, she couldn't say no. She agreed to make that little one part of their big family. 3 years later, the princes were off to school, and Doik would take them. Meanwhile, their little daddy's girl remained as affectionate as ever. They lived their lives with excitement and emotions running high. Weekends came and they spent the entire day together as a family of 6. Today they were having a family photo session, photos that would be forever etched in our memories. Because this story filled us with rage, sadness and desperation, but above all, with hope for such a wonderful ending. In the end, this marriage was perfect. I hope you all enjoyed this story. It truly has been so impactful. It made us feel so many things, and in the end all the bad people got what they deserved. Though to be honest, I felt a little sorry for Yura. On another note, as you might have noticed, we no longer heard anything about Ihu's father. In a way, Ihu never considered him as such, because he never did anything for her, regardless of whether he was her biological father. However, in the end we got a happy ending, and this story into the story. If you enjoyed, please give it a like, and subscribe if you want to see more manhwa recaps. Let me know what stories you'd like to see next. And one last big thank you to everyone that left some really nice words of encouragement and really kept me motivated to keep posting these stories for everyone to enjoy. Until next time, bye-bye.